Oh. You scared me to death. Oh my god. Oh shit!
Now you listen to me and you listen good, son. You think those biters out there are dangerous? What you gotta watch out for is right in here, locked up with us. These people are...
Oh shoot, he wasn't kidding. Oh, nah. Alright everyone, that's the video for this week. Thank you so much. Subscribe to the channel. Thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Thank you. We have 2 more hours to go. What's that? Oh. Released in 2015, Dying Light is an open-world zombie survival horror game developed by Techland. What began as a successor to Dead Island quickly turned into something far more ambitious during the early stages of development. Their publisher for Dead Island, Deep Silver, proved difficult to work with, getting in the way of what Techland wanted to accomplish with that game. Their visions didn't align for the next project either, unsurprisingly, so in an attempt at showing the world they could make a AAA quality video game, Techland decided to part ways with Deep Silver. Warner Bros. Became the publisher for the new IP, and thankfully gave them complete creative control. Regardless of how you feel about Dying Light specifically, I think everyone can agree that publishers allowing the developers to follow their vision is almost always a good thing. Dying Light, to me, is a nearly phenomenal game. The beginning hours are awkward and challenging, yet alluring in their own way. You start in such a bad shape with your equipment and skills, the only way to go is up. The game truly hits its stride halfway through, as you've acquired most of the interesting skills that aid platforming and combat, and your menu is filled to the brim with things to do. The endgame stumbles pretty hard, thanks in part to the lack of airdrops, but mostly because the unremarkable story takes more of a focus. Thankfully, the following DLC helps to remedy that bitter aftertaste with its unique setting and story of its own. Calling it DLC almost sounds disingenuous, it's more like a full-on expansion. Even though it has plenty of its own problems, the amount of content on offer is pretty insane. That goes for Dying Light as a whole. Out of all of the games I've played for this channel, this is the one that took the longest to complete, and it's not even close. There definitely isn't a lack of things to do in Haran, even if a lot of it is fluff, but it is worth noting that because I spent so much time in the game, those few areas that don't excel stuck out even more. Dying Light is great in many ways, however, besides the parkour-inspired movement system, almost everything leaves at least something to be desired. In almost every facet of the game, there's a small helping of mediocrity that keeps it from achieving its full potential. I'll be discussing Dying Light and all of its DLC in detail, so spoilers for the entire game will follow. In my first few hours of playtime, what struck me immediately was how much effort was put in to immerse the player in this world. The music in the background is reserved, the atmosphere is ridiculously engrossing, and many little details surrounding Kyle Crane, the player character, went above and beyond anything I've seen before. It's in first person, which already helps, but even some of the most influential first-person games don't go to the lengths that Dying Light does. When Kyle is talking to NPCs, his voice is louder than the other person.
What kind of deal?
The kind I make with rice, not with his flunkies.
All right, let him through. This ought to be entertaining.
This may be our only chance to reach the airdrop.
What's my part here?
Well, as I said, going out at night is basically suicide.
I don't think I've seen this trick in any other game before, or if I have, it wasn't as obvious as it is in Dying Light. It gives you the impression that you genuinely are in the space your character occupies, and that the distance between him and the NPC is actually there. When you walk through falling water or exit out of a pond, your vision gets blurry for a while. When you're in high altitudes, the camera will veer back and forth, leading me to believe that Kyle is either losing his balance or simply being affected by the wind. Given that this sort of happens as you balance on narrow ledges, it's probably the former. You can see Kyle's feet when you look down, his arms when you run and jump, and when you pick things up, you can see his hand reach out to physically grab it. The same goes for opening chests, fridges, wardrobes, and so on. Given that opening chests and grabbing weirdly packaged loot from dead zombies could take up a shockingly large amount of the player's time, it's difficult to pretend these added animations were put in without reason. After all, it kind of creates a mini decision for the player. The knowledge that you can be interrupted by an attacking zombie might make you think twice about opening a chest until you're sure the area is clear. That is something you'd have to take into consideration if you were actually in a zombie apocalypse. Even ignoring that aspect, grabbing items off the shelves yourself avoids the need to wade through menu screens. This lessens the amount of time spent in your inventory and instead keeps you looking through the eyes of Kyle Crane. All of these little touches help blur the line between the player holding the controller and the character they're playing as. As impressive as those touches were, and as much as I loved them, they also set the bar so high that some of the other areas of the game look out of place as a result. This makes a consistent suspension of disbelief hard to attain, since your brain will be constantly shifting back and forth. One second you're enamored by the engrossing atmosphere, and the next you're all too aware that you're playing a video game. This goes for parts of the world design, some of the character interactions, large swaths of the story, and many, many of the quest lines. Instead of talking about it all right now, I'll provide examples as we go along, otherwise there won't really be any context, it'll just sound like I'm nitpicking. Which, to be fair, I'll still get accused of, but that's fine. The open world of Dying Light, in many ways, is extremely impressive. First of all, it's surprisingly beautiful, and this is coming from a guy who regularly complains about boring color palettes. Generally, when high-budget titles strive for realistic-looking graphics and gritty atmosphere, it makes everything look like shit as a result. Just watch my Dead Rising 3 video if you want more on that. Even though the color scheme does favor the yellows and browns, it does so in a way that doesn't feel pretentious or boring. The vistas in the day are just as gorgeous as the skyline is at night. The constant wind effect makes everything feel alive. Standing still in Dying Light, even though it can serve to be difficult given the constant zombie threat, will provide an enchanting visual. The trees will blow back and forth, sometimes you'll spot some leaves swirling around in the air, maybe you'll hear a bottle stumble across the road nearby. All of this helps keep the player grounded in the present moment. The implementation of the soundtrack goes along with that idea. It's very minimalist, where you'll only hear a soft bit of ambient music here and there to set the mood as you venture forward. Contrast that to the storyline encounters, where you're mostly dealing with regular humans. The music comes to the foreground, which fits the high-intensity gameplay on offer, and because these moments aren't ones where you'll be trying to avoid alerting zombies, it doesn't get in the way. Even though a few of these tracks are exceptional, keeping the music in the background as you explore Haran was definitely for the best. A big part of staying alive is trying not to make too much noise, or, depending on the situation, making a lot of noise, but somewhere else. Just existing in an area will attract the normal horde of zombies nearby, but when you start to make noise, the virals come out. They're much more aggressive types that can run faster than you and climb almost anything. They can be seen wandering around sometimes, but more often they're essentially sleeping in an area that's off limits, generally behind some inexplicably unusable door. You can see these enemies bust out here and there, but what truly makes these enemies terrifying relates to the sound design again. Their screams heard all around you when you make that extra decibel of noise is fear-inducing, and what's even better is the fact that you're almost always able to hear when they become an enemy on the map. As fucking incredible as that bit of sound design magic is, there are two small quibbles about it that became more noticeable as I went on. First of all, I have a suspicion that the sound of them breaking through the door doesn't always coincide with a new viral spawning nearby. At the very least, their screams when you initially make noise can at times be for show, as when you're in a cleared out quarantine zone like a parking garage, you'll hear the same audio, even though there will never be virals in your immediate area. What really confirmed my suspicions was when I was playing the Easter egg Mario Bros level. If you make noise by dropping onto a zombie Goomba, or when the bomber explodes, you'll hear the same initial scream noise, and then even the door breakout sound. All games are smoke and mirrors to a degree, but it kinda breaks my immersion a bit that those sounds aren't always linked to a horde of virals coming your way. Speaking of immersion breaking, my other problem is that the sound of them breaking through the door is exactly the same every time it plays. I'd even hazard a guess that it's the same audio file. I know it's easy to play the role of the entitled gamer who wants more, but I think if there were a handful of these breakout noises that all sounded slightly different, it would have gone a long way. After a while, I just kept thinking how silly it was that they all have the same cadence to their screams and hit the same high-pitched wail the moment the door finally gives way. Since we're already kind of talking about the virals and the noises that attract them, the volume that supposedly gets their attention seems very inconsistent. I completely understand firing a gun, or an explosive barrel or hazmat suit guy blowing up. However, I don't quite understand how the giganto boulder throwers don't get their attention every time they throw a chunk of the road at me, or when the inexplicably large cinder bat wielders smack the ground, which they do all the fucking time. Sometimes throwing a Molotov draws their attention, but not firecrackers. Sometimes attacking with certain elemental melee weapons will do the trick, and other times gunshots won't. I also don't fully buy into the idea that the virals wouldn't constantly be chasing each other, since they all scream louder than anything else on the planet when they spawn in. Maybe you could explain that one away by saying they know what a zombie sounds like compared to human-caused sounds, but if that's the case, I would expect every time a plane flies by to draw all of them out, as well as when the airdrops touch down. Seeing 0 zombies near the supply drops seems like it would go against that idea that noise is what draws their attention, but maybe I'm just not familiar with the timeless philosophical question: if an airdrop falls in the city and no one is around to hear it, does it make a noise? When analyzing the world on a more micro level, it's easy to point to the reuse of many assets and interiors of buildings and call the developers lazy, but I think that's being needlessly uncharitable. First of all, accusing developers of being lazy is never a claim worth making unless you have a lot more than your time with the game as evidence. Is it disappointing to find the same calendars, posters, toolboxes, bags, wardrobes, and fridges in most buildings? Yes, of course. The same can be said about the identical nature of a lot of the interior layouts as a whole, and even some of the exteriors as well. I can understand being disappointed, but to me, it didn't get in the way of my experience as much as a few other things I'll talk about. It's worth taking into consideration that these buildings also act as obstacles in the parkour playground that is Haran. If this was a different game, where moving swiftly through the environment using free-run mechanics wasn't one of the main gimmicks, I'd be pretty underwhelmed, and I'd likely say, at the very least, that the world is too big for its own good. Again, I said something similar about Dead Rising 3. I think my willingness to overlook some obvious copy-paste jobs here and there just goes to show how highly I view the parkour system. The designers have stated that a big inspiration for them was Mirror's Edge, and it definitely shows. Initially, I was kind of turned off by the first-person perspective, as it made getting grabbed by zombies from behind more common, and I wasn't adjusted to the free-running yet. Slowly but surely, my opinion did a complete 180, and now I can't fathom this game working the other way around. I feel like you have so much more one-to-one control of your character thanks to it being first-person. I've played my share of third-person adventure games that feature a half-assed parkour mechanic, and for the sake of not getting flamed for shitting on some popular games in the comments, I'll leave them ambiguous. In those titles, it never feels like you're the one performing the character's actions. All you need to do is hold the parkour button, turn your brain off, and let the game run through a script of animations. It's nearly a cutscene. In Dying Light's version of free-running, the player will need to think about their moveset and how it relates to the surrounding environment. Sprinting, jumping, and climbing onto obstacles requiring an individual button press means you're always the one in the driver's seat. At fast speeds, the player will be reading the upcoming terrain to make important decisions on which path to take, which ledge to jump for, if they'll need to slide under anything, leap off a zombie, or clear one out of the way. Your camera angle even comes into play, as looking down while you clear a gap may stop you in your tracks, whereas if you had looked up, you could keep going without slowing down. Considering how often you'll be moving the right analog stick as you run, it was a very smart decision to map the default jump button to the right bumper. The small nuances at play when changing elevations and platforms also adds to the complexity. All of this means a player will need to make a conscious effort to improve if they want to get the most out of free-running. Getting better will not only be beneficial for completing some of the surprisingly enjoyable challenges, but it can at times be mandatory to escape certain zombie hordes, especially at night. Escaping volatiles and virals due solely to your skill as a runner makes it all the more rewarding. The animations themselves are quite impressive as well. I don't remember ever seeing an awkward or unfitting animation when climbing a ledge or landing the wrong way on a railing. It always looks believable, which is another way the game makes it easy to stay invested. Because the parkour was so stellar in nearly every area, the minor problems relating to it feel all the worse. There are plenty of rock formation ledges that look like you should be able to climb, but you can't, and one of the higher elevation places in the slums is unreachable thanks to an invisible ceiling, which seems so odd considering the level of vertical freedom on offer everywhere else. The grappling hook that the player will unlock near the middle of the game has the same problems. More often than not, you are able to attach onto the ground and rock formations, but there are plenty of areas where you're inexplicably not allowed to for some reason. Given that this could cause you to take a lot of damage, it's very unfortunate when a ledge can't be grabbed or the ground can't be grappled. The grappling hook as a whole is quite the oddity when viewing the entire game from afar. It's framed as if it's any other piece of equipment in your inventory, however you'll never need to replace it, or even make it in the first place, considering you get it for free from the quartermaster. It also doesn't get its own dedicated button. It will take up one of the 4 throwable weapon slots. I think it's interesting how the grappling hook can allow you to essentially skip over an entire section of the terrain you were clearly supposed to climb. The designers have to assume the player doesn't have it, which means every level had to have been created with the player's jumps and ledge grabs in mind. Hearing Kyle talk out loud about how he'll need to climb up to a platform, only for me to zip up there in one fell swoop, is so ridiculous it may as well be a comedy routine. The developers definitely knew how overpowered it was, since they disabled it for certain story sections. The excuse being that Kyle's seizures from being infected are making him exhausted, I guess? A pretty weak explanation given that he can sprint, jump, and pull himself up every ledge and railing in sight. I would think the grappling hook would be easier on the body than the alternative. You also can't use your grappling hook in safe zones. You actually can't do anything in safe zones besides run and jump. This makes so little sense, it's frankly absurd. You already can't damage NPCs. You'll swing or shoot through them like they aren't even there. You can get around that if you're a cheeky bastard like I am, as of course knowing I can't damage NPCs will only make me try harder to. However, there are still NPCs where even that won't do anything to them. Why on earth would they go one step further in the safe zones and physically disarm a player? Because they might abuse the invisible barrier to take some pot shots on helpless zombies? So what? Because it would harm the player's immersion if they could be seen swinging and shooting at invulnerable NPCs? I think I've already shown that no care was given in that regard everywhere else. The only thing this manages to do is frustrate players who want a quick and safe exit after they've slept for the night. Considering the grappling hook can zip you right up to these places, it feels incredibly incongruent that it can't zip you back down. For the high-up safe zones, I often said fuck it and took the leap of faith anyway, hoping the grappling hook would activate in time so I could break my fall. Sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes I didn't even have the grappling hook equipped because the icon on the bottom left was missing. You can use the wheel in the safe zones, which is good, but it just seems like such a strange thing to do in the first place, removing the bottom left icon. The options that I mentioned earlier for the HUD in general are truly baffling. Either you keep everything on screen, remove the map, or show nothing at all. Removing the HUD entirely clearly isn't a viable way to play the game since you'll never be able to see what throwable weapon you're holding. It's already silly that you can't see your health bar, but not providing players the information that will determine whether they'll waste a flare or not is just a broken way to play the game. Personally, I would prefer everything to be on screen except the mission objectives. Get that text the fuck out of here. This is why I never took on bounties, as it clogged up the screen even more. The parkour being one of the most important elements to the game meant the world had to be designed around it. It is kind of silly at first glance to see a literal amusement park of debris positioned all around the city specifically so the player can freerun. Ramps made from broken down doors and window shutters, signs and lampposts conspicuously placed close together, and piles of blue garbage bags in a few key areas to break your fall.
One day I'm gonna do this and end up landing on a bag of rusty knives, I just know it.
An easy way to rationalize this, however, is to take into consideration that the people who are still alive in Haran all seem to have some understanding of how to freerun. It's mentioned that the leader of the tower, Brecken, used to be a parkour instructor, and one of his struggles in the game is believing all he's ever done to help his people is teach them how to run and jump. It only makes sense for the tower's scouts and runners to move around a few things to make certain paths easier to reach, while also keeping the ground level entryways closed off to keep out the zombie horde. This isn't to say the safe houses always logically make sense, however. I understand these specialized lights, once the power is turned on, can roast volatiles at night, but that doesn't explain how they keep virals away in the daytime. The main tower makes some sense. They destroyed the stairs and guard the only ledge in with lights and bodyguards. Rise's tower makes enough sense given how many guards they have on duty, but the optional safe zones are where it gets out of control. So many of these areas use basic chain link fencing, or sometimes just a 10-foot slab of concrete as their perimeter. The pathfinding on the viral zombie types is extremely impressive, but once you see how difficult it is to shake them off your tail, even after climbing up and down 3-story buildings, you might begin to see the regular fenced-off areas as a joke. I know I did. I don't understand why a few of these places were even considered to be potential secure areas. A small fence is something I wouldn't trust with the basic zombies, and considering that goons exist with their cinder mallets that could easily decimate the walls of a national bank, there's no way in hell I'd feel safe sleeping in these makeshift dog kennels. There's also a few where the only entry point is an always open sliding door on the roof. With how often you'll see zombies on roofs like they own the place, I wouldn't feel safe here either. A good example of the safe zones being inexplicably safe instead of logically safe happened with the fake Antizin dealer's location. When the area is just a destination for a quest, you can be attacked by virals on this deck. A few minutes later, when the area is somehow safe enough to sleep in, the deck is now a sanctuary, one where the game won't let you pull your weapons out anymore. If they were so hellbent on disarming the player in safe areas, a lot more effort should have gone into making them look safe beyond an invisible, immersion-shattering wall. As much as I'm willing to overlook many of the more goofy level design bits in the game, such as piles of blue trash bags everywhere you go, and strangely built towers that have more ledges to climb on one side than the other, there's one specific inconsistency that never sat right with me: the doors. Some doors you can open with no problems. Some doors act as impenetrable walls. Some doors are locked and can be only opened with a special key. Some doors are locked and can be opened with a lockpick. Some doors are locked from the other side with a pair of deadbolts. And some doors pretend to be locked from the other side, but in reality, the handle won't turn on either side of the door. It's a mystery why they even allowed some doors to be interacted with in this way if they functionally exist alongside the impenetrable wall variety. Why even have this door locked if the player just needs to walk a few steps to the other side? Why not let them lockpick the door, since it's so easy to walk around anyway? The excuse on why certain doors can't be interacted with is sometimes good enough for me, like when non-blue trash bags are piled up in front of it, or maybe some furniture in the way. However, there are doorways where you'll be forced to perform a button prompt to push over a piece of furniture to proceed, so maybe that isn't the perfect example. At least that's better than a door just not having a handle, as if that would matter in the slightest when you have a sledgehammer. You wouldn't even have to go as far as a sledgehammer, since there's a dedicated kick button, and the game encourages you to kick down certain obstacles, including nearly deteriorated doorways. I want to make it clear I'm not asking the game to be like my ideal Dead Rising, where every building is unique and accessible. I'm just asking that the designers make up their minds and stay consistent. If certain buildings are inaccessible, I'm willing to concede to that idea, but the difference between a door that you can open, can't open, or can't even interact with needs to be a lot more distinct. For example, I and most people would understand immediately that a door design like this signals that it can't be opened. However, when it looks normal with a handle, not being able to even try to open the door completely shatters my suspension of disbelief. It should also go without saying, but the shenanigans where you can't open a door from both sides needs to be removed outright. There should be some attempt at a plausible explanation on why you can't open a certain door. Seeing the same design both for those that can be opened normally and ones that act as decorative pieces is nonsensical. This goes double when in hotels and apartments where the supposed door actually leads nowhere, as if you could open and walk through it, you'd fall to your death. Perhaps the developers got their inspiration from a certain door salesman who hates getting caught in traffic.
See, watch, check this out. Won't open, won't open. Not this one, not this one. None of them open. Fake doors.
As you wander through Haran, in addition to the strategically placed terrain so as to make parkour maneuvering a smoother experience, you'll also encounter a variety of zombie traps. You can't utilize all of them until you're a high enough level, but the leveling is something I'll talk about later on. Early in the game, when you have garbage equipment, you may find yourself relying on your kick button, as it can send a zombie straight into a spike strip that's been conveniently glue-sticked to a car or a wall. There's some spiky barrels and other such pointy ouchy hurt objects that can be used to your advantage as well. It is rather hilarious how much of an advantage players receive when it comes to these traps. You can't be hurt by them, and the zombies will sometimes run into each other, causing some to stumble right into the trap themselves. Likewise, any time they graze the object is instant death, even if it's just their foot, meaning you can slowly kick a downed enemy inch by inch to their death. The random puddles of acid or toxic gas work in a similar fashion. Tarps of water can sometimes sit next to an electrical box, and there's plenty of flammable liquid on the ground in some areas as well. The environment impacting the player's decisions for both the platforming and combat makes the entire city stand out that much more. It gives it its own character. I'm sure a lot of players will fondly remember Haran for years to come, simply because of the large role it played in all aspects of the game. The other traps placed around the city also help set Haran apart from other game worlds. However, they have their share of problems. It's already a shame you can't use quite a few of them when you likely would need them the most, but the physical act of triggering them isn't ideal. When you're close enough to an active trap, the X button will appear on screen. Pressing it will cause Kyle to reach for Spike's magic button and detonate a car bomb or start up an electric fence. Trusting the game to present the button prompt when you want the trap activated can lead to frustrating results. Sometimes you'll definitely be close enough, but the prompt won't be there when you want it. Sometimes you'll be completely out of sight, yet the X button won't leave you alone, making it so you can't even reliably loot containers without the worry of attracting virals. This seems extra silly considering that the Y button is only used when held down, either repairing weapons or looking back as you sprint. They could have easily mapped the traps to a Y button press instead, which would have avoided firing off a car bomb when you're trying to reload, or activating a light trap when you're trying to grab a mushroom. This gets worse when there are multiple traps clumped together, as sometimes you may want to activate an electric fence and not a car alarm, and vice versa. The light traps as a whole seem like they don't offer much. I've tried to use them, but they only work on volatiles, and even then, flares are so much more useful as they stay active far longer. Another thing that's kind of disappointing about the traps as a whole is the fact that you don't have a say in where they should go. During one of the first missions, you'll be told how to set a few of them up, but not only will you almost never need to do that at any other point in the game, they've still been placed in that location by the developers. Or, I guess, Spike, actually. I think it would have been very interesting if you had a say in where a few of these traps were placed. My idea would be to have half of these traps placed in Haran already by previous runners like Amir, and then let the player set up a limited amount of them in a few weak spots they'd come across. I'd imagine that might make it more difficult for online co-op and invasions to function as they currently do, however. If the hosting player could have a say in the environment in a small way, that means that not only would the game have to keep those unique placements in its memory for them as they play offline, but also make sure the other players in a session can see what the hosting player is seeing. Keeping the traps as static as every other building and vehicle on the map is likely easier than the alternative. In fact, the only thing I can remember being permanently affected by the player is blowing up the blockade in one of the tunnels, which afterwards makes traversal through that area a bit easier. That, plus turning on the water fountains and clearing out the safe houses, were unfortunately among the only times I felt I was having an impact on this world. I'll expand on that later on in a different section, however. Scavenging for supplies in Haran, even though on paper seems like it would be monotonous, manages to fit in with the core gameplay loop of Dying Light. You don't often have to go out of your way to find supplies, as you're always close to a building that has a toolbox of blades or an aid cabinet with bandages in it. Certain items are more difficult to come across than others, which makes a few tedious side quests even worse, but we're not there quite yet. For the most part, simply playing the game normally, exploring some of the apartments and houses nearest your destination is often enough to get by. You have unlimited space in your inventory for miscellaneous objects that can be used for crafting, such as bandages, nails, alcohol, and so on. I generally prefer when items take up space in some way, like having a limited inventory or a weight capacity, but considering how many unique ingredients exist in Dying Light, I guess I'll just be thankful I don't have to second-guess grabbing a box of nails. It is strange that not every object that looks like it should be grabbable is, however, such as bottles of alcohol that are just for decoration, even though they look identical to ones you can pick up. This also goes for certain types of herbs as well, which makes certain side quests even worse. Even though you'll barely have to think when grabbing metal parts or household supplies, when you come across weapons, it's a different story. You have a limited space when it comes to equipable objects such as guns, flares, molotovs, shurikens, and so on. In the beginning, you'll likely be grabbing anything you can get your hands on, like a random water pipe or a board with nails in it, but after a while you'll become a lot pickier. If you keep engaging with the game at face value and treat every chest as a reward, You'll likely find yourself frequently opening that godforsaken menu to throw something out or scrap it for parts. The menus in this game as a whole are pretty bad, however I at least have to be thankful they don't make you navigate them with the dreaded controller cursor like so many modern games do. Pressing up or down will take you to the next selection as it should. My main problem with the menus, besides the annoying issue of them resetting your position if you perform certain actions in them, comes down to how they display information. It's just a single column list. This goes for every menu in the game, with the only exception being the collectible screen. You usually won't have to scroll to the bottom of your inventory, but if you're in the mood to buy ammo from the shops, it's a different story. They did think to include a sell all valuables option, which is nice, but maybe they should have also included a buy all ammo option. There are also a handful of times in the story where everything in your inventory is taken from you and put into your stash. The menus are already so clunky and messy to deal with, I barely know what I have equipped at any given moment, let alone what's in my inventory. It's nice that they have a button to put back all of the non-equipable items, but that still leaves you scrolling through, trying to figure out which weapons you are currently carrying or where your Molotovs and firecrackers are. Perhaps the developers never expected a player to use the stash throughout the game like I did, keeping a reserve supply of weapons in case of emergencies, or maybe the game could do the obvious thing and include a button that returns your loadout to how it was before the story mission, and leave all your newly equipped, most likely garbage weapons in the stash instead. On the topic of equipment, I can't help but point out how utterly ridiculous it is to have to wait for a meter to fill up when crafting things in the menu. I try to avoid pausing the game whenever possible, so when I do eventually need to craft some medkits, I'll, in all likelihood, craft as many things as I can while I'm here and get it all out of the way. I understand when in hard mode the game doesn't pause, so it taking a second or two puts some pressure on the player. They'll have to make sure they're in a safe area before opening the menu. On normal, however, pausing does what the word implies, it pauses the game. Forcing players on normal to sit through the crafting load screen is at best an obvious oversight, or at worst, a petty and stubborn refusal to grant a quality of life improvement for players who chose the easier difficulty. This is the worst case scenario for me, as I didn't even want the benefits the pause screen provided, but I'm still stuck with this terrible mini load screen while I mindlessly press the confirm button. If the game had a real-time crafting system, one that opened up an easy-to-read menu for quick decisions, I'd take that in a heartbeat. I have no problem having to wait that time if there's a reason for it, but on normal, there isn't a reason. The differences between difficulties are a little too rigid as it is. A customizable difficulty is something I hope we see in the sequel. Personally, my ideal would be to keep the game running while paused, and have your flashlight go out after a while, but have the medkits heal right away, and show volatiles on the map at night. When talking about crafting and the menus, another obvious oversight that's hard to ignore is the fact that they don't show the player how much of a particular craftable they currently own when in the blueprint menu. It does show you how many you can make, and how many individual uses you'll receive, but if you really want to know how many medkits you have, you'll need to switch tabs and scroll all the way down for some reason. Considering certain items require the same ingredients, such as Molotovs, medkits, and flammable liquid all using alcohol, it seems like one of the first things you'd think to include on these screens is the player's current quantity of said item. The way the weapons themselves seem to scale to your level is also pretty disappointing. It's hard to get excited about a potential reward from a hard-fought chest if, in all likelihood, it's going to be comparable to what you have right now. Considering that weapons break after a while and can only be repaired a handful of times, it seems silly not to throw the player a really good weapon every now and then. When I first saw a melee weapon that had over 700 base damage, I was blown away, thinking I had found some incredible killing machine. Of course, soon afterwards I'd find plenty more that had similar numbers. A nice comparison is this chest found in a cavern. On a fresh character, it has a Garbo weapon, and on a max-leveled character, its damage numbers have skyrocketed. Inadvertently or not, this transforms the act of hunting for loot into an exercise of keeping your head above water. If the weapons weren't tied so strictly to your level, it would provide more reason to open every single locked chest you find. As it is now, exhausting every area of its resources will only net you an overflowing inventory of samey weapons and some valuables to sell for cash. This might be one of the reasons the beginning and middle stages of the game are the most captivating and magical, as close to the end these issues become more noticeable and harder to ignore. After a while, it also becomes entirely too predictable to guess the outcome of locked containers. The non-locked chests will almost always have one craftable item and some coffee or cigarettes to sell, and the locked ones will almost always have one valuable good, which again essentially functions as money, and either a throwable weapon or a melee weapon. Every van that has its trunk unlocked will always contain a bag to search through, the yellow emergency vans with an easy lock will almost always have a medkit or two, the police cars with the medium lock will usually have some craftable item or a weapon upgrade, and police vans with a very hard lock tend to have an upgrade and a melee weapon. Both the police vehicles have a chance to contain a gun, which makes them great targets for early players. However, when it comes to the police vans specifically, far more often than not, I would simply find a melee weapon. Considering how long it may take you to open a very hard lock, finding a baton can be pretty disheartening. The lockpicking minigame is such a big part of the gameplay loop that by the end, you may be beyond fatigued and simply start ignoring locked chests. These minigames have been around for quite some time. The earliest I can remember seeing them was in Fallout 3. There are a couple of differences that make Fallout 3's implementation a little better than Dying Light's, however. First of all, that wasn't the only minigame. It also featured a form of hacking as well, where you need to find the correct keyword. I'm not here to defend this wholeheartedly, as it also got tedious after a while, but at least there were sometimes two potential ways to enter a locked container. Secondly, containers that would require a lockpick were far less common in Fallout 3 than in Dying Light. It doesn't help that the game constantly resets the locks and rewards to give players the feeling of a never-ending game. Whereas in Fallout 3, if you looted a chest, that chest stayed empty. You could argue this is because one game is trying to be an RPG and one isn't. However, I'd absolutely disagree with you there, as Dying Light has an RPG leveling system, it locks better weapons and skills behind those levels, and as far as the world building is concerned, Dying Light at least tries to address how these survivors get their food. I don't want a never-ending game, I want my choices, even ones as simple as if I cleared out a locked chest or not, to stick. As far as I can tell when testing it out, after 4 or 5 in-game days, the vehicles that have already been looted will restock and lock themselves again, all for the player's convenience. Finally, in Fallout 3, if you really got tired of lockpicking, you could try to force the lock, which, with one button press, could either open the locked box immediately, or make it inaccessible forever. If that was an option in Dying Light, I would have likely used it, because
Christ on a crutch.
did lockpicking get so monotonous after a while. Even ignoring the overuse of the minigame, there's almost no depth to it, and it never has any hint at where the sweet spot will be besides trial and error. I'd assume it would be physically impossible to open a few very hard chests in a row with a single lockpick. This goes double if using a controller. Now, all that being said, I can definitely see the upsides to lockpicking. Whereas I previously compared it negatively to Fallout 3, at least in Dying Light the game keeps playing in the background. You'll have to make decisions on how to acquire the time and space you'll need to get the container open. I just wish there was more of a reason to take the time to open a hard lock near the end of the game. Given the tediousness of it all, and the predictability of the rewards, the main reason I kept opening them was out of habit. I completely understand the emergency vans always having medkits and police vehicles potentially containing guns. That makes sense, and the consistency will assure that players will unlock them when necessary. However, every chest containing at most 2 items, the combinations being a valuable and a weapon for a locked chest, and a craftable and a weapon for an unlocked chest is, in a way, hilarious. This goes double for the GRE chests in quarantine zones. You'd think these would vary at least a little bit in rarity, weapon damage, or even contain a gun or two, but I don't think I've ever seen anything from a GRE chest that genuinely got me excited. If these really are supplies from the GRE, I'd also imagine it would contain medical supplies, flares, or rations like the airdrops do. The fact that the GRE put valuables in every chest doesn't make any fucking sense. The worst is when it comes to the regular bags you'll find, as far more often than not, the only thing you'll manage to dig up is a measly sum of cash. Maybe if money could do more than just purchase equipment for you, the player, I'd feel better about it, but given that I've already said how often my inventory was full of weapons, the money just felt pointless. This unfortunately had a knock-on effect, as it turned the buses into something entirely skippable. The only thing you'll ever find on a bus are loads of bags, meaning, regardless of which stage of the game you're in, you may as well run past them. Even though the names and descriptions initially made me think otherwise, the craftable weapons weren't one of the things that looked out of place to me. I figured a flaming sword would look magical and ridiculous, but it being a blade with a blowtorch attached to it, while adorably goofy in its own right, is a lot tamer than I was expecting. Maybe this is partly due to me being fresh on the heels of playing Dead Rising 4 on stream recently. Early on, you'll be lucky if you can take out a zombie with less than a dozen hits, but after you find some weapons with higher damage numbers, craft them into something elemental, and give them upgrades, you'll soon be slicing off heads in one stroke. With the amount of gore involved, I, at times, felt kind of guilty about how much satisfaction I got from slicing a zombie's head off. It's even worse when it's regular humans. However, not to victim blame here, but these random hostile survivors clearly have a death wish. Even though after a while you can slash without thinking and take out a few guys no problem, the combat with melee weapons to Rise's men and other random humans in the early game is pretty rough. You eventually learn how to dodge backwards and sideways, but they, and only they, know how to block attacks with a melee weapon. They can also randomly duck as well, and considering you don't have a way to alter your swings besides moving the camera angle, you'll be whiffing a lot of attacks. You deal so little damage to them when you do finally make contact, but you die almost immediately if they catch you with one of their swings. A few of the skills make up for how little damage your early game arsenal can inflict. However, I still think it's kind of ridiculous that pounding a dude's exposed head repeatedly with a pick isn't enough to kill him. The melee weapons being as useless as they are early on when fighting humans furthers the need to own a gun, but finding one isn't as simple as it sounds. Thankfully, when you do eventually acquire a gun, getting a headshot is usually an instant kill, and their heads exploding feels just as satisfying as the machete lobotomization. The guns being unbreakable feels really bizarre and out of place with everything else. I realize they use ammo, which in a way could be viewed as a degradation for guns, but they still can't fully break down. It was sometimes a relief when a melee weapon broke enough times that it couldn't be repaired anymore, as that meant using a newly acquired weapon in its place. As it is now, finding a new rifle is useless if it has a lower damage number, so that satisfaction of restocking your armory or having a backup when your current one breaks doesn't exist. Unlike your unlimited supplies, you can't stockpile ammo above a certain number for each gun. This restriction does aid the idea that this isn't a typical shooter game, but I'm not sure if prohibiting players from placing ammo into their stash at safe zones makes sense. Since you can buy it from merchants already, either way you could return to a safe area nearby to obtain ammo. Being able to slowly add any extra to your stash would make it so you wouldn't constantly find worthless ammunition to guns you aren't currently using. For example, if you don't use your pistol often, placing all of the pistol ammo in your stash for the future would mean you could still collect any you find afterwards. The low ammo count and the fact that guns almost always attract virals provides a good enough reason to not stick with them the whole game. Using them becomes its own decision, whether the enemy you're up against is worth the risk of being overwhelmed by virals. Early on I would have said no, but once you come across some of the harder variants, it's better to pop a few headshots and then deal with the horde later. There's a bow in the game as well, which has now become a pretty common stereotype for zombie games, but at least the trope makes perfect sense. Obviously, it being a deadly weapon that can shoot projectiles without making much noise fits right in. Some of the craftable tools are quite fun to play around with. Throwing some firecrackers to clump a group of zombies together, dousing them with a bottle of flammable liquid, then tossing a Molotov to finish the job was a combination that felt so natural it's hard to believe I wasn't outright told to do it step by step. It's also incredibly rewarding to see a volatile close in on you, only for you to throw a firecracker behind him, luring him away long enough so you can snag an airdrop. The throwable weapons, such as the shurikens and axes, felt pretty good to use, however, their auto-aim functionality was rather hit or miss. It did help on some occasions, as it would seemingly home onto the target's head, but there were times when the auto-aim would cause an axe to hit the environment instead. I've seen some people online complain that the wingsuit you receive for playing the Easter egg Mario level isn't as useful as they'd like it to be. I don't think it was ever meant to be anything more than a fun tool to use post-game, so I'm not quite sure if I understand the complaints. If anything, I was kind of surprised at how beneficial it was when clearing small gaps. I won't go in-depth with all of the craftables and my thoughts on them, but I feel the need to point out that Kurt's bomb kind of sucks. It's said to attract zombies for a while before it explodes, as he's placed firecrackers inside a tin can grenade. The problem is, it explodes almost right away, providing almost zero time for the zombies to walk over to it. As I said before, early on in the game your equipment won't be the best, and part of the reason is how the progression system works with the quartermaster and the merchants. Essentially, your survivor level is your character's level, and the merchant's inventory is tied to that. Every new level unlocks more weapons at the shops, however they're not that distinct, it's just a rarer color and a higher damage output. I don't want to think about how little sense it makes that your survivor rank ties into what equipment random merchants have, but I do want to point out how utterly absurd it is that the merchants who live in the tower wouldn't provide you with the best equipment possible. Maybe during the first few outings they don't want to waste quality weapons on an unproven runner, but after a few missions, Kyle Crane is clearly the best the tower has, and is seemingly the only guy constantly risking his life in order to help these people. Why not give him a fucking rifle, huh? You'll rarely find guns at the merchant's shop when you'd want them either. I only ever saw them show up when I was very far into the game and already had a pistol and rifle for a dozen hours or so. As I said, there's never a reason to replace your guns if the damage is equivalent or less, so if anything, it was just another absurdity to add on to the pile. Everything being ridiculously overpriced and comparable to things you can find out in the wild completely breaks down the in-game economy. This negatively affects other areas of the game, since if there's nothing worthwhile to spend your money on, then the vast majority of the items you'll receive from scavenging any kind of chest or container end up being worthless. Why even bother going out of your way to hunt for loot if your inventory is already full? The valuables you collect will just be turned into money, that money can't be used for anything besides weapons, and those weapons aren't worth buying since your inventory is already filled with similar weapons. There needs to be some other use for money. Maybe some rich dude hoarded all the antizin somewhere, and you can essentially pay to keep people alive in the tower. Maybe some type of investment into the tower itself, where you pay a builder to upgrade the tower and improve the quality of life for the residents. All of my solutions essentially boil down to a few greedy people with high-value commodities or skills charging real money for their use. It's not perfect, but neither is the system as it exists now, where obtaining valuables from GRE chests is actually pretty pointless. It is worth noting, however, that my proposed solutions would make the game very different, so it isn't like it's as simple as a menu optimization or anything. As you progress through the game, you'll receive experience for 3 different sets of skill trees. As a whole, I generally find skill trees to be a less than ideal way to distribute new skills or buffs. Often, you'll simply unlock everything anyway, so it's not as though you're designing your own build, and since the trees don't usually branch off into more focused ways of playing the game, it all seems pointless in the end. It's essentially a way to block the player from more interesting ways of playing the game until later. When used correctly, however, it can evoke a certain feeling in most players. There is a stark difference between playing on a fresh save file opposed to a fully leveled up character. Even though there are skills I think the player should have at the beginning of Dying Light, I have to give them credit for truly making you feel helpless and fragile in those opening few hours. Your weapons will be garbage, you have no supplies, your health pool will be low, you can't craft that many things even when you get supplies, finding a gun isn't a simple task, you can't utilize all the traps around Haran, and many of the most important skills are locked away from you. Kyle is an outsider narratively, but the player is an outsider mechanically. It's a really good example of when the story and gameplay on offer coexist quite nicely. The longer you play the game, accomplish tasks, and expose Kyle to this world, the more he improves as a result. It's one of the better progression systems I've seen when it comes to modern action-adventure games. My main problems mostly have to do with the few specific skills and when you'll receive them. Because the parkour is so integral to the experience, not being able to slide immediately is a pretty bad decision. It's made all the worse, as early on you'll have to pick between the slide ability or the grapple maneuver. Likewise, locking the exploding car traps behind Survivor level 10 feels pretty cruel as well. Keeping the stomp technique hidden behind level 9 of the power skill tree is probably the worst example of them all. Kicking a downed enemy's head in is something anybody would be able to do, and the fact that it requires a special prompt in the first place is ridiculous as well. The left bumper is your kick button, but you can only pull off a killing blow kick when the left bumper prompt shows up. If not, you'll continue to kick their head in, but for some reason it's not the same. Now, I understand this technique is very powerful, especially considering you can cheese virals by goading them to climb up and get stomped into oblivion, but it's just a simple kick. The only thing I could think of when my constant bashing of an enemy's head couldn't kill them was why on earth couldn't I just straddle their torso and begin pounding their face in? Once I saw the stomp attack in action, everything started to make sense. For the sake of progression, sometimes believability needs to take a back seat. As far as individual skills go, the dodge skill works well after you get the hang of it, but I feel like it has an irritating knock-on effect when it comes to platforming. Sometimes I truly did want to jump, only a little to the left or the right. However, if you try that, you may end up falling to your death. The dropkick is extremely satisfying, especially when you Finn Balor someone into a car or Rikishi them off a building. However, it not working at all on a few enemies is pretty lame. The leg breaker kick while sliding is a good idea, however, I think a better skill would have been to allow swinging with a one-handed weapon while sliding instead. The tic-tac wall jump maneuver seems like it would be super useful, so much so that you wonder why it took so long to acquire. However, this was one of the skills that made me want an option to turn some abilities off. Far more than it being genuinely helpful, I tried to grab a ledge that looked climbable, he got into his tic-tac position, then with what seemed like any input on my end, sent him soaring in the opposite direction. The power attack never felt like it did enough damage to justify its use, and considering how long the animation takes even after letting go of the attack button, it often backfired and left me in a worse position than when I started. The double damage to your throwable weapons was a really good idea, since around that time ninja stars and the rest were beginning to become less useful. Likewise, the elemental throwing stars as a skill seemed outlandish and worthless at first, but they really surprised me with how helpful they could be. I never really found the boosters to be something worth carrying in your inventory, and considering I'm one of the 1.6% of players on Steam to bother finishing the parkour challenges, the stamina buffs clearly weren't necessary for when you'd need them the most. They do come in handy when playing online and doing the prison DLC, but that's about it as far as I can tell. Considering how much I shat all over the currency and shop systems, the haggling skill seemed extra superfluous to me. Apparently, lower prices in the shops weren't supposed to correlate with skill points, at least not directly. There was initially a reputation system, where if you completed enough tasks, the people of the tower would trust you more, and in turn, Kyle could get cheaper goods. You can definitely see something like that with the DLC The Following. Considering that their previous idea isn't that dissimilar to grabbing airdrops and completing side quests to boost your survivor ranking so you can select these skills as a level up reward, I'm not sure if the alternative window dressing would have changed my feelings on this in any significant way. Lower prices for an overall bad currency and shop system wouldn't affect that much. The fact that there are 3 separate skills in the survivor tree dedicated to the shop system is just a joke. Clearly they couldn't think of better or more interesting ways to keep the same number of abilities in every tree. The nimble hand skill, where you loot dead bodies faster, is fucking embarrassing. Most often you'll find money, which I've already discussed in detail why that would be a disappointing thing to find. Increasing the chance at finding better loot from dead bodies is worded just tantalizing enough that it might sway a few players out there. Don't fall for it. Obtaining a battery from 1 dead body out of 5 isn't worth it. The specialist skill is incredibly frustrating. It just says you'll score more critical hits with blueprint weapons. Wait, hang on, that's me making an assumption. It actually says, learn how to use blueprints more effectively, you'll score more critical hits. What on earth does that entail? Are the critical hits the result of blueprints being made more effective, or is that something else? How much more likely will you get critical hits? How much more damage does a critical hit even do? The craftsman skill says the same blueprint effectiveness thing with a dash like before, but this time it's somehow even more vague. Every time you use a crafted weapon, the elemental effect is increased and you deal more damage. I genuinely don't know what that's trying to say. Is it saying that every time I use an elemental crafted weapon, like a flaming shuriken, that my next attack with any weapon is stronger? If it's trying to say that I'll deal more damage with the elemental affected crafted weapon, surely it wouldn't use the words every time you use a, as that almost implies it provides an effect that the next attack gets. I don't know what it means by the elemental effect is increased, and of course they don't show any numbers or percentages, so how would I know how much of the elemental effect it's adding? Do Molotovs have a wider blast radius? Do their flames burn longer? Or do the residual flames do more lingering damage? It's a shit show, and the fandom page didn't have any answers for me. After you reach the end of one of the skill trees, you unlock the legend tree. Even though I don't love never-ending games, I do think this is a really great inclusion for people who just want to keep playing the game. Experience earned for the tree that's filled up, such as power, survivor, or agility, will be transferred to the legend tree instead. Here you can make passive upgrades for your character, such as health, melee damage, unarmed damage, and so on. The only passive increase that seems out of place is for stamina, as if you maxed out the power and agility trees, you've already received infinite stamina for the respective stamina bars. I can tell this video is getting long, but don't worry, we're almost out of the individual gameplay elements section. The enemy design for Dying Light is in some ways fantastic, some ways bad, and some ways a little uninspired. On one hand, it's kind of nuts that the special zombies from Left 4 Dead are still being used for so many zombie games. On the other hand, is that really a bad thing? The boomer type that draws out a larger horde, the big brute that's tougher and charges at you, the asshole that spits acid at you, the frail-looking one that mimics human cries to lure you into their trap card. You could even argue the volatile has hunter characteristics, as it pounces you from far away, and the bolter holds a resemblance to the jockey as well. Is it unoriginal? Maybe a little, but if the game works with those enemy archetypes, what else can you say? I'm still holding out that my favorite zombie type, the Smoker, makes an appearance one way or another in the sequel. I'm sure Dying Light 2 is out at this point, but just so everyone's aware, alright, I'm recording this before the game comes out, so all my predictions are genuine. The Virals, even though they're one of the basic zombie types, have the most interesting mannerisms. They were the most recently turned, and as such are much faster and more intelligent. However, they also have some fairly haunting reactions to being attacked. Oftentimes, you'll see them back away and kneel down with their hands up, and you can even hear them cry for mercy in English. This is definitely the human side of them coming out, either as a natural human instinct to stay alive, or a cunning game of possum to manipulate. Either way, it got in my head a bit when I first encountered them doing it, and made me think about them in a different light ever since. Goons are beyond tiring to fight. Their attacks have a gigantic blast radius on them for some reason, so more often than not you'll get knocked back even if he didn't even touch you. They also seem to reset their animations now and then. Using melee weapons, I have no idea how anyone is supposed to reliably take them down. Out of all the specialized zombie types, these are the least believable to me. I'm totally on board with the idea that the special antizin-infused meat that the doctor was using to test a few things is what caused the mutated zombies, but these guys are just taller, more muscular, and all inexplicably wield a gigantic rebar mallet. Maybe if you got to see a few of these guys without the rebar, even spotting them grab a street sign out of the ground, it would be better. As it is now, it just feels very gamey. The bomber zombie type is an enemy I don't even think should be in the game. This is the only exception to what I said earlier. Instead of the boomer bile in Left 4 Dead, they explode, which attracts the virals because of the sound it gives off. That's fine in theory, but the explosion itself is extremely damaging, and the designers clearly placed these guys in areas where you're more likely to run right into them. Open a door and turn a corner, you see a zombie and swing, dead. It's frankly bullshit, and the clear intent behind it all is one of the only ways where I question the integrity of the developers. It just seems like they were trying to catch players out for the sake of it, without any real care about how fair the encounter would feel. The Screamers are definitely analogous to the Witches of Left 4 Dead, except this time they don't insta-kill you, they drain your health bar slowly and draw in other zombies. They're also children-sized, which I think is very interesting. You can't murder children in video games, it's just not allowed even with an M rating. However, this is an example of it being okay, because for some reason, if you make them a zombie and therefore technically inhuman, it's no big deal. It's kind of hilarious actually, as it just goes to highlight how absurd the standards are that video games have to adhere to. The Demolisher is a big boy that likes to charge and throw rocks at the player. They usually have armor, I suppose implying they were once police officers and the like. A side quest basically confirms this. I don't have many insightful thoughts on them, I just think they can be tedious to fight if you don't have a gun. The specific boss fight with one of them in the pit is arguably the worst encounter in the game. I figured my attacks weren't damaging him since his health bar wasn't going down. I spent a long time doing nothing before eventually trying to slap him around a bit more, and only after a few swings did I finally see his health bar go down. Very unintuitive. The Bolters may be my favorite zombie type in the game, however I'd argue they aren't taken advantage of as much as they could have been. I like how important they are to the story and to the finding of a cure, but hunting them down, besides being helpful for a couple of craftables, doesn't really do much for you. The gameplay interactions with them, however, offer a fun change of pace, as you have to either sneak up on them or chase them around. Since they only come out at night, the Volatiles are a real risk when trying to get some bolter tissue. The Volatiles are definitely the most imposing enemies in the game. Since they only wander around at night, they make the nighttime half of the game feel a lot more tense and dangerous. On normal difficulty, you can see their vision on your minimap, but on hard, you can't. As much as I'm a stickler for holding immersion on a pedestal, I vastly prefer when I can use the map to plan my path. On hard difficulty, I had to rely on the hold A button thing, which if anything is just as immersion breaking as the minimap is. Regardless, they do thankfully have a small delay before chasing you, and the sound design plays a very important role in all of this. You'll know if one has their eyes on you the moment you hear the specific audio cue. If their vision bar fills up, the ambient nighttime noises are replaced with a heart-pounding chase theme. These moments are some of the best the game has to offer when it comes to horror. The flares and UV lights being their weakness is great, however I don't understand why your UV light is less powerful against them as they are against invading hunters. When playing online, any flash with a UV light will block their pounce, but with the Volatiles they can sometimes ignore not only the UV flashlight, but even flares as well. The volatiles and the virals alike also have way too much hit stun. If you're being hit by one or two of them, you don't even have enough time to throw out a flare to save your life. With how strong they are, and how easily they can catch up to you if you try to run away, at the very least they shouldn't be allowed to prevent you from using your equipment. In terms of believability, I only have one small issue. They come out to wander Haran every single night, but I just don't understand how any of them stay alive. If you spot one as daylight breaks and choose to follow them, it's clear they die when exposed to sunlight for too long. That being the case, why on earth would they venture out so far from their hideouts? I chased a few of them for what seemed like a few minutes and they still weren't home yet. When you get to see a few nests up close, the DLC The Following being the best examples of this, it seems like they're more intelligent than your average zombie. They're trying to multiply. If that's the case, I don't know why they would be going against their survival instincts as often as they do. Perhaps they have more of a bee-like brain, however, where certain volatiles have certain duties, and because the ones we see roaming at night are going to die in a few days anyway, they can risk venturing out for more breeding material as they're seen as expendable. I doubt that's what it is, but it would be pretty cool to stumble onto a queen volatile and other distinct variations in Dying Light 2. If that does happen, I totally called it. There's another zombie type, technically, and that's the one that appears when you get invaded by a different player. I would imagine the invasion mechanic was inspired by Demons and Dark Souls. Unfortunately, Dying Light's iteration isn't nearly as seamless, however. It basically pulls the victim into a PvP match with its own rules and victory states. The invading hunter needs to defend their nests and obtain 10 human kills, while the human side needs to destroy all of the nests. Personally, when playing as a zombie, this game mode is a blast. There's an entire skill tree for the zombie side, and swinging around the city alone is very enjoyable. All of my problems come from the human side of the equation. When you're the invading hunter, you specifically chose to invade someone's world at that moment. When you're the human, you just happen to have online enabled at that time. You are signed up for it, but considering this feels more like a PvP match separate from the main game, it can really take you out of the moment. It's also one of the least balanced PvP modes I've ever seen. Even with an inexperienced zombie player with barely any skills unlocked, and facing 4 players in a post-game area, it's still ridiculously skewed in the zombies' favor. That being the case, the fact that an invasion can happen when you're in the first few hours of hard difficulty, of course you'll have zero chance at winning. You don't even have a gun yet. The Pounce ability is clearly overpowered, given that it's an insta-kill, but even the zombie spit that attracts infected goes way overboard. It draws in suicidal hazmat suit zombies that run up to and kill the player instantly. The player's UV light isn't anywhere close to strong enough, and it has way too small of a battery, especially when you're the only player in the match. Holding A to see where the player is on the minimap is good, but it doesn't last nearly long enough, and considering you'll always want to know where they are, you'll be pressing and holding the A button fucking constantly. It is nice that the player gets rewards even if they don't win, however, even if it's a clean sweep, you're still dying 10 times in a row. Even ignoring the obvious time waste the game mode is when you're clearly outmatched, if you're a newer player, dying even 3 times in a row is enough to never turn on the game again, or at the very least to never enable online. At least with Dark Souls invasions, it's 1 death at most per invasion, not 10 in a row. I genuinely felt really bad anytime I invaded the player's world, as it just guaranteed them a good 10 to 20 minutes of a game mode they weren't asking for, and one they'll have no chance in, especially if they were playing solo. At the very least, I'm glad there's an option to never have invasions enabled, and to even forfeit the match immediately. If the player is a good sport, though, and is trying to engage with all of the mechanics of Dying Light, they may feel compelled to keep online always active in an attempt at giving the full experience a shot. If they do that, they may feel inclined to keep invasions possible in the daytime as well, which in my opinion, again, goes completely overboard. Because invasions have to happen at night, it turns your clock forwards to compensate, but still leaves you in the dark afterwards. This either means you'll be spending a lot more time exploring Haran at nighttime, or you'll be repeatedly finding a bed to sleep in after every invasion. Overall, this mode needs a gigantic overhaul. As it is now, there are so many problems with it, it's hard to justify its inclusion. Lastly, the human enemies I don't have much to say on, but the few things I will say are mostly negative. The humans with guns are the least interesting enemy groups in the game for me. Not the worst, but just the most boring. Aiming down sights while playing whack-a-mole isn't a fun time for me, and considering how much damage their bullets do to you, trying to fight back creatively will often backfire. The melee variants have that annoying habit of becoming a bokoblin from Skyward Sword, effortlessly blocking your swing even when it doesn't make any sense. Speaking of not making any sense, in Old Town, hostile survivors unaffiliated with Rise begin attacking you. As I said earlier, it's like these guys have a death wish. Considering that Crane is a near unstoppable killing machine at this point in the story, Goobers prancing up all tough only to be sliced down in one swing is just embarrassing. I don't understand what these enemies add to the experience, if I'm being honest. In my opinion, the worst aspect of the human enemies relates to the kick button. You can't kick them off of buildings or ledges, they just won't budge. You can kick zombies no problem. In fact, you can kick zombified versions of Rise's men no problem, but Rise's men? Literally Andre the Giant. Considering there's an achievement for kicking enemies to their death, this one felt very incongruent. Even though the open world is incredibly immersive, and exploring it on your own is one of the best parts of the game, the fact that it takes completing a couple hours worth of story quests to fully get to is a bit of a shame. The day-night cycle and airdrops will be unknowingly locked away from new players until they finish the Antizin supply drop for Jade. Don't get me wrong, giving beginning players a chance to explore and complete a few side quests in the daytime before adding more into the mix does make sense, especially considering they're being protected from the volatiles. However, the way the developers structured these 2 days cheapens the world and believability quite a bit. Before being allowed to take your first steps in Haran, you'll be assaulted by tutorials and cutscenes in the tower for 30 minutes straight. The next hour or so isn't truly yours either, as the story quests will need to be completed before the world truly opens up. As the player finishes the tasks set for them, the sun goes down according to how far along they are. The night drawing close is used to raise the stakes, as the player will need to rush to the safe house they just cleared out to sleep until morning. The player then sees this prompt, telling them that the prologue is complete, they can now play online, and the full Dying Light experience is now available. This is, of course, a lie. Airdrops and the day-night cycle are still off limits. I think it would have been better to hold off on making such a bold claim until the player finishes Day 2, since they would then be introduced to volatiles and relief packages. There would still be a few lingering areas that they can't access quite yet, but at least then the game world functions like they'd come to expect. Even though it was kind of silly to witness the choreographed sun not set until I went into the safe zone on Day 1, that's nothing compared to Day 2. After you exit the safe zone, it's sunrise, as of course you just woke up. Since you weren't that far away from the tower, running back to meet up with Brecken and Jade won't take very long. However, after leaving the tower, it's now sunset. This is extra silly considering that the player will likely have 2 or 3 early side quests available to them, and 2 of them are clearly meant to sound like they take priority. While the player is busy murdering the fake Antizin dealers and grabbing a movie for Ghazi, the sun will remain in its current position the whole time. Even though you don't have the clock display on the menu yet, and even though you can't check your watch like it's Dead Rising, if you swing, you'll catch a glimpse of it. It stays at 18:30 the whole time, right up until you get closer to the main story mission. Afterwards, it pauses and stops depending on how close the player is to the objective. I can understand this to a degree, don't get me wrong. The night being right around the corner is integral to this mission functioning at all. The whole point was that Rise's men have less of a chance to get the drops that happen closer to nightfall. Once the player gets there, it sets the stage for a dramatic moment with the GRE, and afterwards the volatile introduction is sprung on the player at the perfect time, right as they were likely invested in the story. It all works, but it's just a shame that the designers didn't seem to have much of a plan to make Day 2 run smoothly besides turning the entire day into a sunset vista. Even though I was initially much harsher on this section, I've come around to it the more I've thought about it. The game is punishing enough as it is, so allowing new players to grab chocolates and a movie for Ghazi in the never-ending daytime without worry isn't the end of the world. The fake Antizin dealers are a different story, but we're not there quite yet. Moving past all of that, besides the quests, which, as a reminder, I haven't even talked about yet. Fuck me, this is a long video. Besides the quests, there are quite a few things to find and do in Haran. Random events can pop up from time to time, such as rescuing survivors from either zombies or Rise's men, finding survivors desperate to tell you about their lives, and random merchants eager to sell you items that are eerily similar to ones you'd find at the tower's shop. There's a few escort missions, quarantine zones, random parkour or combat challenges, and of course, the airdrops. The airdrops are the one thing I've been the most excited to talk about. I know, over an hour in, and we're only now just getting to it. For anyone who hasn't played the game and is still watching, you're a fucking all-star, so I'll give a brief rundown. Haran has been quarantined for some time, and the survivors and zombies alike are trapped in the city. To keep the many survivors alive, a humanitarian agency has been flying planes overhead, dropping supplies down a few times a day. In these airdrops are things like medical supplies, flares, and disaster relief on-site packages. Besides a few that are tied to certain missions, all of the airdrops happen at random times of the day. Because most characters make it seem like the drops are one of the most important things in the game, and because it's a way to level up your character quickly early on, players are highly encouraged to go after them. What makes these events more interesting is the fact that Rise's men, the enemy faction of the city, also hunt them down. If you get there quick enough, you'll have 2 crates all to yourself. If you get there too slow, Rise's men will be there protecting it, and if you don't even try, or it somehow takes you even longer, the game will declare the airdrop as stolen. Given that there's always a time limit and a contextualized in-game reason on why they're coveted, these airdrops may cause players to stop everything they're doing the moment they hear the plane fly overhead. If you're using a controller, it's even better, since you'll first feel the controller rumbling when it draws near. The relief packages are, in a way, the greatest thing in the game. It's interesting because on the surface, it may kind of resemble a Radiant quest, since it's a repeatable objective that spawns in many locations. It's also, in many ways, a fetch quest, which is another thing most people sneer at. This is an example of when the surrounding context can really make all the difference. Yes, it is repeatable and somewhat random, but taking into consideration that there's a zombie outbreak endangering civilians in a quarantined area, yeah, it makes perfect sense to be repeatable. Considering that the GRE were aware of supplies being stolen and not always getting to the right people, yeah, it also kind of makes sense that they wouldn't always appear at the same times of day or locations. They were even giving Brecken a video feed from the plane when they dropped the relief supplies. In regards to it being a fetch quest, considering how important these supplies are to the survivors in the city, and that Kyle Crane is among the only living runners the tower has at its disposal, it also makes perfect sense why you're the one who always needs to retrieve them. This is actually the reason why a lot of the real fetch quests the game offers don't bother me as well. The city is overrun by zombies, so naturally an unskilled rando wouldn't be safe out here. Because Kyle is contextually significant and is one of the only able-bodied people who can parkour as well as he can, yes, of course I'll be the one to grab crayons for the kids or a gardening book for dummies. Because the parkour mechanics are so solid, any excuse to sprint, jump, and climb means you're engaging with the best parts of the game anyway. Having that timer in the back of your mind, trying to beat Rise's men to the drop, is simply one of the best feelings in the game. That being said, because it's so great in so many ways, this is also one of the biggest disappointments the game has to offer. Make no mistake, from a gameplay perspective it's just as fun. The main problems stem from an overall lack of immersion and a lack of in-game significance. First of all, it doesn't make any sense why only 1 crate is available to you if Rise's men beat you to it. You can kill them fairly easily after a while, but even still, one of the crates will always be open with some cans in it. You can't loot the dead bodies for the missing supplies, and there's no way they had the time to take it back to their hideout yet. You can even see one of them moving cans out of the crate. I understand punishing the player if they were too late, but I feel like the extra enemies you'll need to handle would be punishment enough. You'll also never see Rise's men running towards the crates, they just spawn there after a while. This may seem like a nitpick, but bear with me. I completely understand how difficult it would have been to program Rise's men to patrol the city, then send the nearest group to rush over in real time. It was 2015 when Dying Light came out, so I realize how unrealistic it is to ask for, and how petty it would be to complain about. I'm not specifically complaining about it, but if somehow they can get what I just described to actually function in Dying Light 2, holy fuck would that be amazing. All of that being said, the main issue with the supply drops is completely unrelated to Rise's men. It mostly comes down to this fucker. Not him specifically, just what he represents. For how long I went on about the relief packages being important and contextually significant, the game doesn't recognize your efforts in any way, shape, or form beyond experience points. Nothing about the survivors' dialogue hints that they've even noticed you've been hauling hundreds of pounds of supplies for them. They don't take up any inventory space, meaning there's barely a reason to second-guess your choice. They can't be sold for money, so there's no moral dilemma at all. And for all the efforts they went to for the sake of immersion, you don't even get to see them being handed over, much less see a surplus built up somewhere in the tower after you've been prioritizing the airdrops. The only thing this affects is your survivor level. The patronizing and careless attitude from this specific quartermaster only managed to rub salt in the wound. He can't bother to make eye contact with you even though you've just brought him 6 crates worth of supplies. His responses also don't make sense sometimes. It was tiring hearing about how he didn't want the children to starve and yada yada, but he also has a line about being impressed that I beat Rise's men to the airdrop. This particular line happened to trigger even though all of the relief packages I had just handed over came from an abandoned quarantine zone, not an airdrop. The reason all of this is so disappointing is they didn't manage to do anything interesting with the crates after you pressed X to open them. Of course, being able to see the rations and medical supplies helping the people of the tower would have been preferred, but considering that there are a few quartermasters existing in different locations with their own groups of survivors, I would think at the very least they could have encouraged the player to spread the wealth. Wouldn't it make sense to not hoard all of the resources at the tower if there are groups elsewhere that need some? A player like me, who values suspension of disbelief, may end up avoiding every other quartermaster and stick to the patronizing asshole once they realize that handing the packages to anybody else doesn't even elicit a response. You're the only person in all of Haran who risks their life to chase down these supply drops, the only one consistently providing relief packages that at the very least contain medical supplies, and they don't even say a word. Even Spike just stares at you, which is beyond baffling, as he even goes out of his way to tell you that he's hanging out at the barge, which means nothing to you.
Hey, what's up, Spike?
Just FYI, if you need me, I'll be at the ferry station helping Morgan prep the barge.
How could the developers not patch in some voice lines for these quartermasters? Am I really the only one who cares about this? The relief packages not having any effect on the world was when I realized how much potential Dying Light was squandering. They almost had a slam dunk. All they had to do was make these supplies at least look like they're helping in some way. I would love it if there was a dynamic system in place that tracked how well the survivors are doing comparatively to how many supplies you've brought back. I would love if survivors in the tower could die depending on if they ran out of medical supplies or something. I understand both of those are infeasible and would drive some people away from the game, but at the very least, I would expect the dialogue towards Crane to be more welcoming. This idea of the game not responding to what you as a player are doing permeates every inch of the experience. Like I've already pointed out, the buildings and vehicles will reset the resources after a while, the airdrops don't actually mean or do anything, and almost every quest in the game gives the impression that it's somehow time-sensitive, yet all of them can be perpetually placed on the back burner, waiting an eternity while you dick around opening your 100th lock chest, or even trying to get the best time in a parkour challenge. Again, I understand that time limits and failure isn't what this game is about. Would I love and welcome a demanding and unforgiving clock presiding over the whole game, counting down your minutes until failure? Of course, if you've watched my Dead Rising videos, that should be pretty obvious. Majora's Mask is another one of my favorite games, and part of the reason is the 3-day time limit gimmick. However, I know these games aren't for everybody. I know a lot of people don't like the pressure, which is why I'm perfectly fine with games not including it. I just ask they don't make literally every single storyline and side quest sound like they should all take priority, and that they're all somehow time-sensitive. Instead of pointing out all of the times where this ridiculousness happened in a list format, I'll just draw attention to one egregious example and how it could have easily been avoided. Jade says she's going to wait for you in the boxcar near the train tracks to plan the next move. This takes place after the Rise extortion missions, meaning all of the enemy types in the slums are now available, the quarantine zones are available, and a plethora of side quests all became available in quick succession. With how eager I was to explore the world on my own, Jade never stood a chance. I let her wait in the boxcar for probably an in-game week. Of course, all the while, the tower has no antizin, which is important when characters bring it up, but not important enough to avoid helping a director film his action scene, I guess. What they should have done was have Jade tell you to let her know when you're at the boxcar, and she'll meet you there. That would, at the very least, avoid the earth-shattering realization that Jade has been sitting in a train car for a fucking week. It wouldn't fix the antizin urgency issue, but that's a whole other bag that can't really be solved with how Dying Light is structured. All of this is to say that the game doesn't have any idea on how to manage this priority dilemma. The fact that certain objectives, like helping Fatine and Tolga, or getting pills for Brecken, have the same importance as getting antizin for the tower or rescuing Rahim, is at best incredibly incongruent, and at worst, assures the player that their involvement actually doesn't matter. A real person in a real world with real consequences would easily see how important the airdrops are, along with doing whatever it takes to get more antizin. They'd probably tell Olga and Fatine to fuck off, and they'd definitely ignore time trial races set by other runners. I'm not really saying anything groundbreaking here. This is always a problem when it comes to open world games. If developers aren't ever going to try what Dead Rising did, maybe Breath of the Wild can inspire them to think about their open world a bit more and the problems that arise with presenting dire doomsday-level consequences when there really aren't any. You could easily argue Breath of the Wild has the same issue with Ganon, but at least they didn't have characters constantly talk about how in 3 days, Ganon will free himself and shit all over Hyrule. Now, I am still talking about the airdrops, remember, and I haven't finished quite yet. This video is so long that you're just gonna have to bear with me. All of the negative aspects about the airdrops still being what they are, the gameplay involved was so addicting that the moment they came back in the DLC the following, I got hooked immediately once more. In Old Town, the airdrops are replaced by Rise crates, which just exist on the ground randomly and for some reason always have Rise's men protecting them. Going to specific locations on the map to find these crates always surrounded by human enemies isn't nearly as satisfying as spontaneously running towards the airplane you just heard. As I said on the outset of this video, this is a small way in which the latter half of the game wasn't as strong. Even though I related the airdrops to Radiant quests, the random events that show up as a blue symbol are a much better fit for that phrasing. These are generic in every sense of the word and spawn fairly often. My main issue with the Rise's Men one popping up is mostly due to their behaviors and how the game responds to it. On one hand, it is nice that they sometimes back down and even run away when they see you have a gun. On the other hand, the game clearly doesn't want you to be merciful, as it shoves your nose in the fact that the patrol ran away. This is extra hilarious if we take the ending to the story into consideration. We're not there yet, but keep this in the back of your mind for later. Rescuing survivors comes in 2 flavors. Some of them are already safe behind bars and are screaming for their lives for no reason, and the other they're being attacked by zombies out in the open. Both of them follow the same formula: you kill the zombies and you get some kind of reward. For some reason though, the survivors in this game are magnetized towards danger. Even after you've saved a few, it's clear that unless their domicile is nearby, they're just going to die after they run away. Something about their pathfinding or their priorities when moving around is absolutely fucked. It's actually worse once you get to Old Town. Since the random survivors aren't being attacked by regular zombies, they pick a fight with demolishers. This unfortunately takes me out of the moment every time I see it. There's just no reason why people trying their best to survive would square up with these guys. I tend to avoid them when I can, and I'm the player character. I don't even bother helping these idiots out anymore. They made their own bed. You also might encounter survivors that just sit around and wait for a therapist to walk by so they can dump all of their problems onto them. It is nice to hear some backstory about some people, but because these generic NPCs aren't real people, it's hard to give a shit. This kind of demonstrates how a little window dressing could make all the difference. If these were real characters that had even a small quest attached to them, I might have stuck around to listen. Instead, they burn in hell. Given my love for the first 2 Dead Rising games and the escortable survivors, I was very interested in seeing how the Protect missions would play out. These kind of pop out of nowhere on the map, and I have no idea what triggers them. Even after finishing the game, a bunch randomly got added all around Haran. These are some of the worst bits of content in the entire game. If Techland wanted my opinion for some reason on how to fix these missions, I'd likely recommend they outright remove them instead. If you fail at other tasks, like dying when in a quarantine zone or not reaching your target time, resetting the area and enemies makes enough sense, I suppose. I have to suspend my disbelief hard already when it comes to the endlessly respawning zombies, so it happening once more isn't that big of a deal. For these missions, however, the failure state is the survivor dying. For the random Radiant survivor rescues, the game can easily let that survivor die because it will spawn a dozen more anyway. They're generic, they're meant to be forgettable. These Protect mission survivors, however, have names, they have unique voice lines. That being the case, if you try and fail one of these, the last thing that should happen is them reappearing in the exact same location and triggering the exact same dialogue. Is this werewolf guy kind of interesting? Sure. But he made his fucking choice the first time, when he ran into a horde of zombies. Him getting another chance, only for Kyle and him to have the same conversation, was irritating at best, and utterly baffling at worst. The paths they'll take you on are generally filled with side stops, which is fine, but I noticed a trend in all of them. Near the end of the mission, they always go out of their way to attack a gigantic zombie, usually a goon. My guy, come with me, walk around him, what are you doing? I've kind of already touched on the challenges in passing, but I was pleasantly surprised at how much fun I had with them. Obviously, most people don't feel the same way, considering barely any of the Steam player base has finished them all, However, I could see that coming down to how the map displays the challenges. You don't have any idea if you finished one or not. They all have the same icon when you want to find a new one. Because they're split between two areas of Haran, which at the very least requires a loading screen teleport after traveling back to the tower in each area to get to, I doubt players bothered with hunting for the unfinished parkour challenges. The fast traveling system in general is extremely odd, to the point where I'm honestly confused as to what the developers were thinking. As far as I can tell, you have to go back to the central hub tower in each region and click on the poster that shows the other area. However, that could easily be something players wouldn't even know exists in the first place, and getting back to the central hub tower could take a long enough time to be a genuine hassle. This wouldn't be a problem if you couldn't just pick a random quest in each region, quit the game, load back up, and spawn there instead. If it's so easy to get around the system, I don't see why they couldn't have let you fast travel to the opposite tower in the menu. I'd also vastly prefer if the game loaded you into the nearest safe zone every time you booted the game up, not this weird jump to objective thing it has going on right now. In addition to the parkour challenges, there are a few combat missions as well, which let you play with a superpowered melee weapon or a gun with unlimited ammo. These are all fine, but one thing that probably guaranteed that most players didn't finish all of them was the buffer time between new challenges. Once you finish one of them, it says to check back with that person later when they have something for you. They don't even give you a heads up on the radio either, it just requires some amount of time to pass before you can participate in the next variation. The last freely available thing to stumble on in Haran are the quarantine zones. In almost every open-world adventure game I've played, enemy encampments of some kind were the contextualized combat arenas of that world. That's what I was expecting going in. It was basically a foregone conclusion that strongholds populated by Ryze's men would fill that role. This made the discovery of the quarantine zones all the sweeter. If anything, these reminded me more of the vaults from Fallout 3 and New Vegas instead of the regurgitated enemy camps that every other game has. Each area being unique in its own way, sometimes with its own gimmick, really made them stand out all the more. The apartment was the first one I tried, and considering it said the difficulty level was hard, I was pretty nervous. Instead of volatiles attacking left and right, there was a constant tick damage thanks to the heater being busted, causing some smoke to fill the hallways. I don't know for certain, but it felt like if I crouched down, I didn't get damaged as often. The objective here does say to clear out the nest, implying it is more like the enemy camp clearings I mentioned earlier. However, even here, there's a lot more room for cautious exploration. You aren't really testing your combat skills, you're more engaging with the unique area the same way you would if it were any other part of the city. The grocery store where the ground is initially electrified was memorable, and the goal of obtaining all the relief packages was more engaging than simply clearing out zombies. There's also a few tunnel quarantine zones, all of which being great, but one really stood out. You'll need to drop train cars onto the sewer entrances, otherwise virals will continuously spawn. It's funny how differently this one can go depending on if you've read the instructions or not. One time I was dying left and right, getting frustrated that the virals kept spawning, and the next time I blocked the sewers immediately and cleared out the remaining zombies no problem. A few of these quarantine zones were DLC apparently, and as a player who only got a chance to experience the game 6 years after release, the implementation felt so natural that I wouldn't have even guessed they were DLC in the first place. We finally gotten to the side quest of the game. Aren't you all excited? This is the 26th page of the script, so I'm happy to see the end is in sight. As a preface, I absolutely won't be going through all of them, just the ones that I have thoughts on in some way. One through line that's evident when looking at the majority of missions in the game is that Techland seems lost when it comes to providing a satisfying conclusion. So often the finale would be as uneventful as bringing the quartermaster a relief package. Sometimes I'd even say, out loud, "Oh, it's done." Or, "What the fuck?" That last quote is actually what I said live on stream recently.
That was so much better. 7 seconds! 7! What the fuck?
I get that he was likely killed by Ryze, but the fact that he just appears dead on the ground is a truly bewildering sight.
Did you not see what happened to him?
The same abrupt conclusion happens with the Bozak posters, where, after taking the time to finish all of his challenges, he attacked me, and then I slapped him once or twice and he keeled over. Incredible stuff. There's another one, which is far more egregious in my opinion, considering how much build-up it had, but I think I'll end this section with that instead. First, let's go back to the beginning. I think it's kind of ridiculous how there are 2 early quests that come from Lana, and in both of them her dialogue makes it seem like they're more important than the Antizin problem. The Ghazi mission makes some sense to do this early, as the player will mostly be doing some creative platforming and exploration, but the fake antizin dealers seem really difficult for how early in the game this takes place. First of all, you can easily ignore this group of men surrounding a door for as long as you'd like. On my first playthrough, I didn't know how to help them, so I just kept ignoring them. If you do that, these fellas will just keep standing here in this spot forever, even though major events are taking place at the tower. Brecken doesn't care, I guess, because he's a garbage leader. All it takes is you talking to one of them, and then they make you lockpick the door. Anyway, there's a dude in bad shape from taking fake antizin. You alert the medic, she tells you to find out how he acquired the fake antizin, and yada yada. This eventually leads you to this group of bandits. Here's the main problem I have with this quest. Fighting these human enemies as early as level 3 is, I'd say, impossible. I've explained how the human enemies can block your attacks, deal way more damage than you can, and so on, but they can even block your throwable weapons as well. There's 5 of them in here, and considering the garbage loadout you'll have in the first few hours, you'll stand no chance. The only thing I could see working is throwing a lot of Molotovs in here perhaps, or, of course, lucking out and finding an early gun. When you have a pistol, this quest is ridiculously easy. I think this goes to show how much respect Techland has for the significance between a wrench and a gun. After you murder the bandits, Lana says the dude who took the fake antizin will make it, but he wouldn't have if I had found him even a few minutes later. Remember that I kept him waiting for a week in that room. It should also go without saying, but she says this if you finish it a week later or the moment you receive it. There's a quest to bring back a gun to this man Dawood, as he wants to leave this place with his son. I think this is a perfect goal to give the player right away, since it doesn't pretend to be time-sensitive, but it does sound important, and the vague nature of the objective won't lead players to a specific location on the map. It's a lot more free-form in nature. Finding a gun sounds easy when you just start the game, but it's a surprisingly difficult thing to do. The best part of this quest line is the dilemma you might face once you do find your first gun. You have finally found a pistol. However, should you give it up so a quest line can be advanced, or do you keep it for yourself since it's the only one you've managed to find? More of these loose and decision-filled quests would have been welcome. As far as the many fetch quests available to you, the more personal ones were decent, like finding someone's glasses and gardening book, or even a journalist's camera and bag. The journalist one even has a cool moment where the car that has the camera in it falls off a bridge, and you need to dive underwater to retrieve it. However, there are a few that literally have you go collect 5 of some kind of plant for someone. That's the least creative quest you could think up, so I'd be happier if those were removed from the game entirely. The 2 missions with Alfie are a mixed bag. On one hand, they sound really cool, and if they played out and had the impact that Alfie hints at, they might be some of the best in the game. Because nothing you do in the game has any impact on the people around you, however, they're not nearly as interesting. When I heard that he wanted to not only set up the power grid again, but activate it at night to destroy a hive of volatiles, that got me extremely invested. If this were real life, and everything about Haran and volatiles were exactly the same, I can easily see how taking out dozens of volatiles at once could be beneficial for everyone. There has to be a finite amount of them, surely, so cutting those numbers down would only serve to help people when they're out at night. Of course, however, zombies will respawn and fill the streets regardless of what you do. There will always be volatiles at night, no matter what. The fact that the trap didn't even seem to do much after I activated it made it much more of a letdown. Maybe it's my fault for not approaching the area at night, but waiting in the room until it turned nighttime. I feel like that would be something a player might do, however, so I'm not sure why they didn't account for this. The other quest for Alfie has the same supposed danger involved. He wants you to retrieve the working military UV lights from the bridge. However, because half of them are burnt out, you have to do it at night so you know which ones to grab. This means that after you grab the lights, you'd be unprotected, and the volatiles could tear you to shreds. However, once you take into consideration that you have an infinite inventory, and that you don't actually carry them on your person, they vanish in your backpack, it would be ridiculously simple to just jump into the lake the moment you have all of them, avoiding any zombies on the bridge. That being said, it is still very high up, which increases tension. However, the game let me do the quest in the daytime. All I had to do was grab all of them, and heal anytime the broken ones shocked me. Clearly something went wrong here when designing this quest, or at the very least, Alfie's dialogue is misleading as all hell. This would be an incredibly high-stakes task if this were a game like Death Stranding, where you wouldn't be able to hop off into a big pool of water as you'd obviously break the lights you just grabbed, and you don't have an infinite inventory, so picking the right ones would be paramount. Because Dying Light has none of those restrictions, it completely falls flat in execution. It's all the worse given that neither of Alfie's missions leave any lasting impression or help anyone in the tower in any way. It's just a task for the player to do because you're playing a video game and you need things to do. Even though it mostly involves fetching random supplies in a boring fashion, Tolga and Fatine are probably the most memorable characters of the game. They talk to Crane as if he was born yesterday, calling him an oaf, a primate, and so on. They bicker back and forth over silly things, but they share a bond when it comes to creating ridiculous contraptions and insulting the player.
Hey boys, what are we into this time?
Do you understand what a battery is?
Tolga, you're overwhelming him. Inside the engine compartment of a bus is a heavy rectangle.
I know what a battery is.
Okay, we need bus batteries with marine-grade plates and rated at 1300 CCA or better.
CCA means cold cranking amps.
Obviously.
That's a pretty big battery.
Yes, easily 50 to 55 kilograms each.
That's equal to several large rocks. He's American. The metric system makes him angry.
The only thing I can say about the tasks they give you is at least one of them finally gives you a reason to walk into a bus. The final thing you grab for them is in a military base on the other side of Infamy Bridge. This area is one of the coolest places in the game, as it's not required for any story section, yet it houses a plethora of medkits and other supplies. That being said, it is the perfect example of when the grappling hook is inexplicably unusable. I do like that you need to get across the gap by climbing up and sliding down the zipline. However, this gap is clearly small enough that a grappling hook should be able to close the distance. So much of the game points to the idea that the grappling hook was added during very late stages of development, and the answer to it being so overpowered was simply not allowing the player to use it. The end of the Tolga and Fatine questline is pretty entertaining. After everything is completed, you finally get to see what they've created. A submarine, which is a pretty smart way to escape the city considering that the military have been destroying any boats that attempt to sail away. However, this is the result. Even though there are technically more quests in the slums than in Old Town, the latter is where there are a lot more stumbles and dumb finishes. There's a mission involving a bureaucrat who supposedly knows of a bunker that's stashed with supplies. The original task was to convince him to give you the location so you could bring back the supplies to the tower. In a very bureaucratic fashion, he needs to get all of the proper paperwork filled out, so he sends you to get the official mayor's stamp of approval. Once you do, he makes it clear he's going to be forging forms with the mayor's seal, and he gives you the location of the bunker. Of course, it's locked, so you'll need to find the key on a demolisher who last had it when he was still human. After all of that, it turns out the bureaucrat guy ended up forging paperwork from the mayor, decreeing that the bunker's contents belonged to him. Remember the way the Bozak and Rocket missions ended? Yeah, this one ends in a similar fashion. The same thing happens in the detective quest, where you'll go after whatever caused this kid to have some form of PTSD. It ends up being pretty traumatic. He saw his dog split open by some unhinged horrible dude. However, that psycho is still here, and he, of course, dies with a few bullets. They keep doing this, where there's so much build-up, some of it being tedious busy work that overstays its welcome, but when it comes to the climax of the quest, it's completely underwhelming. The biggest example of this mentality is with the fan zone mission. There was a distress call coming from this building, so Crane decided to go check it out. As you walk through, you can hear the pre-recorded message play over and over.
Anyone who can hear this, our situation is dire. There are women and children here. We can offer electronic equipment and ammunition in exchange for medicine, food, and drinking water. Please, help us.
The bodies laying all around, and the lack of any sort of living thing in this building makes it an extremely tense few minutes. You eventually find the source and turn off the recording.
Help us. To anyone who can hear this, your situation is dire. I've killed women and children here. I can offer you death in exchange for your medicine, food, and drinking water. Come to me.
This sent chills down my spine. This is the perfect setup to a legitimate horror encounter. The fact that Crane immediately radios Troy to tell her about it kind of undercut the mood, but thankfully she tells Crane to get the hell out of there, which was a decent course correction. The loudspeaker guy tells you to take the elevator if you want to fight, which I thought was a trick, so I went looking for him. The soundtrack in this section fits the horror vibe so perfectly, it caused me to jump out of my seat at one point. Watch my reaction when I hear the music get louder. You then take the elevator, it gets stuck, and you're forced to climb through a narrow air duct. He threatens you as you crawl along, even shooting a few bullets in your path to toy with you. All of this was seemingly building up to a difficult encounter, and considering how quickly you can die in this game, I was preparing for it every way I could. Once you hop down, you'll see that he's filled this floor with gas that damages you, much like the apartment from before. My nerves were going through the roof, so when I eventually did find him, I unloaded a full clip without thinking. And that's it. Surely, I thought, he would get back up. Surely that wouldn't be what this incredible horror set piece was building towards. I was then told to go turn the power on, which I did, but I was still on edge, expecting that gas mask guy to be a hostage or something, only for the real threat to emerge. Nope, that's it. I remember thinking how underwhelming that was, and how, in a way, that kind of encapsulates the entire Dying Light experience. In every facet of the game, they do a good job building the foundation, but when it comes to the payoff, they phone it in. In a way, I can kind of understand why this lack of a climax exists in almost every questline. In Dying Light, there really isn't a lot of room for a traditional boss fight. When the final roadblock is a single enemy, there's not much more they can do, unfortunately, given how realistically fatal the headshots from the guns are, and how overpowered your melee weapons may be at that point. What else were they supposed to do? This is why I can sympathize with them, but maybe the designers should have elected for a group of enemies to kill, or something closer to what I had envisioned, where the first person you see isn't him, it's a hostage that you killed. Really, one of the main things holding this game back is the fact that it doesn't lean into the RPG side of things more. Since I've been talking about it quite often, if this were a questline in a Fallout game, I'd imagine there would be someone to return to when this was done. Maybe you helped out some faction and can now go ahead with the next task for them. Because this was just a one-off event that had nothing to do with anything else, it felt a lot more isolated from other parts of the world. This isn't strictly a bad thing, but it also means that a lot more of the heavy lifting needs to come from the environment itself, the backstory, or the character interactions in that area. They need to make sure that this self-contained section of the game is worthwhile on its own. It was initially, but once the ending played out the way it did, it's as if it never happened. One less side quest on the pause screen, and some more experience for the player. There are a few other missions in the game that are interesting and potentially worth talking about. I just don't have much to say on them. Helping the former mayor of Haran, the one you've seen pictures of around the city, was at the very least interesting, and him offering you a way to escape the city got me motivated to pursue a boring fetch quest. He ends up not bringing you along, as the pilots got wind that Crane was a GRE operative, but still, not bad. There are a few side quests that have you helping some ordinary people who were at one point working for Rise, and of course, Rise is the ultimate evil, vindictive psychopath, so he sends people to murder them in the end. Thankfully, they just so happen to attack those people right as Crane is talking with them, so he's able to protect the doofuses. Finding and turning 3 valves around the slums to get the gas line working again was kind of fun, and it led to a pretty funny moment where the almighty Doomsday Wall ends up just being a concrete slab with flames here and there. It also explodes, killing the survivor inside. That's fun. In Old Town, there's a similarly enjoyable quest where you'll need to find and turn on the water valves in a few areas. This has a genuine lasting impact as well, as from then on you'll be able to use the water fountains to regain some health. It's great that this was included, however, it comes so late in the game, it ends up being worthless. Medkits or other healable blueprints you found are probably already stacked in your inventory. There's a visually interesting fetch quest where you'll hunt for meteorites, using generator-powered lamps to spot them glowing in the dark. That's it. Those are all the side quests I wanted to discuss. Now all that's left of the main game is the story and everything that comes with it. However, before that, we're going to take a quick pit stop and discuss the non-following DLC. Bozak Horde, The Prison, and Hellraid. Bozak Horde is a pretty bad name for this DLC, as it isn't what you'd expect to see from something called Horde. A better example would be Bozak Trials, as that's really what you'll be doing. You'll be stripped of everything in your inventory, and you'll need to complete simple tasks within a given time limit, such as killing all of the virals, finding and defusing the bombs, do some parkour races, and so on. I'll admit, this is the only area of the game I haven't fully completed, mostly due to how tedious it felt. I did think it was interesting how the game mode distributes healing items, as you'll need to chase down bolters and search them for medkits. If you complete the 20 trials with a friend or two, it turns into a PvP match, which, in all honesty, is pretty cool. My main complaint about Bozak Horde is the same complaint I have with certain story sections. If you happen to leave this mission as your tracked objective, when you load the game up again, you'll end up here, meaning you'll have to switch outfits if you don't want fucking scrubs on, and you'll need to dig into your stash and take out everything you had equipped every time this happens. Dumb. The prison is something completely different. Instead of stripping you of your inventory, it's advised to gear up as best as you can, as this gauntlet is incredibly imposing. What the prison DLC provides, and what I wanted from it, were very different. I thought it was going to be another area to explore, one that would be similar to the quarantine zones. Instead, it's essentially a speedrun funhouse, where getting to the armory within a given time frame will allow you more time to collect the rewards. Without knowing this beforehand, the timer at first may look out of place, but you'll likely continue exploring like normal. You might think how odd it is to see so many rooms be devoid of supplies. Once you finish, you might be extremely confused to see a new timer at the top of the screen. Instead of explaining my initial reaction, I'll let my previous self react to it in real time. Take it away, past Dorkaxe. I highly doubt they're gonna make someone remake... Oh, I don't have that much time, what the fuck? Prepubescent... What the fuck did that say? I feel like there's probably like an optimal... Like, okay, if you want this, it's over here. If you want this, it's over here. If you want this, it's over here. That kind of thing. You gotta get those batteries, man. That's why I can't... You know what? Screw this. I didn't come to the armory for batteries. I didn't come up for household supplies either. What's with all this ammo? I don't care about ammo. I feel like there's... I feel like all this is a distraction. Take the fire... Oh my god. Here's the good stuff. Are you kidding me? Lockpicking? With this time limit? That's insane. What the fuck? That's ridiculous, my guy. Oh my god, this is insane. This is insane that they're doing this. I can't believe they're doing this. Especially with all the animations that he has to go through to open shit up. Are you kidding me? I was clearly on the saltier side when I initially got to the armory, but I did say a few things worth considering. The animations taking as long as they do for the sake of immersion, coincidentally or not, added a lot more pressure when trying to grab as much loot as possible. I think I was correct on the distraction point as well. The opening room specifically seems like it's a gotcha, where you'll go through the normal routine of opening the first thing you see, only for that to drastically reduce the time left to collect the good rewards. I've heard that it's smart to grab some of the ammo and such if you wanted to farm this game mode though, as you wouldn't have to go back to the slums to restock. The amount of time you receive in the armory to collect supplies is tied to difficulty as well. I haven't tried it, but if you manage to get under a certain time window on Nightmare difficulty, for example, you'll get 3 minutes to collect rewards. The weapons when getting the Guru reward turn to gold tier as well, which I of course haven't done. On the outset, it does flat out say that this is for the hardcore Dying Light players, and after having watched a few of the quickest speedruns I could find, I can definitely see the appeal. Even though my initial reaction to seeing the armory clock tick down was negative, over time I've come to see the whole thing as a net positive. There are already plenty of areas to explore methodically at your own pace, and the entirety of the following expansion is enough to satisfy anyone who wants more content. This being so different and aimed strictly at one demographic, I think, is a good thing. If you don't like it, I'm fairly certain this was free, so it shouldn't be worth complaining about. The Hellraid DLC, however, is not free. I personally had to spend $10 on it, since it wasn't part of whatever edition of the game I had purchased however long ago. Since I'm kind of on that topic, the many different versions of the game and the many DLC packs surrounding it are way too confusing. Dying Light Platinum Edition, Dying Light The Following, and Dying Light The Following Enhanced Edition all come with different amounts of content. I'm assuming I had the Dying Light The Following Enhanced Edition, as it did come with The Following and Bozak Horde, but not Hellraid. The Season Pass also doesn't include Hellraid, bafflingly, which likely played a part in the mountain of negative reviews it received. Anyway, if all of this is what we can expect from Dying Light 2 as well, consider me exhausted. Even though the reviews made me wary, Hellraid managed to pleasantly surprise me. The biggest flaw without a doubt has to be the lack of parkour and shooting elements. The parkour movement system is my favorite part of the game, so I can understand feeling annoyed by its absence. Most people would probably say the melee combat isn't as enjoyable as the shooter gameplay on offer. However, I'm not one of those people. I did enjoy the melee combat in the game, so an entire game mode where that's all you'll be doing, set in a medieval, demon-infested dungeon, was right up my alley. The whole thing felt more similar to an Elder Scrolls game, except without the heavy long-term RPG mechanics, but instead slightly better moment-to-moment gameplay. Every enemy in the game has been reskinned to fit the medieval underworld setting, so seeing a Minotaur take the role of a demolisher was pretty entertaining. I could easily see myself booting this back up at some point in the future, since it may hold me over until we inevitably get a remaster of Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Oblivion is better than Skyrim after all, so I would welcome it with open arms. When it comes to the story, it's definitely a mixed bag. Techland said that many people may be impressed with the story, and that it's more mature than most zombie games out there at that time. I don't think I disagree too strongly with that claim, however, it leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to character building, themes, and overall story structure. One thing that can't be denied, the voice acting on the whole is really good. Kyle Crane specifically, who was voiced by Roger Craig Smith, fucking blew me away. Initially, I was bummed that the main protagonist was just a generic white dude, but upon hearing the quality of the voice acting, that disappointment faded away pretty early on. I still think he looks like a derp, however, but that may just be because we never get to see him outside of the main menu. The voice acting for the GRE agent is also absolutely gripping. I wasn't able to find the person who voiced that role for some reason, but either way, shout out to her, stellar work.
We're not paying you to be insubordinate, Crane. Get this done.
The introduction has a lot going for it, however, there's frankly way too much information given to the player in such a short amount of time. As well, considering how long it will take the player to really get into the meat of the game, front-loading all of this backstory and context is basically them shooting themselves in the foot. One playthrough could easily last 40 hours, and almost none of what is said in this debriefing is ever shown or mentioned again. I try to get myself into the game as best as I can early on, but this is way overboard. It's a shame, too, because the scene itself is really cool looking. The HUD all around the screen is eye-catching, and parachuting down to the city in first person is a phenomenal visual. In fact, all of this is so engaging, it might distract the player even further from this one-time exposition dump. Very odd. Amir sacrificing himself to save Crane and Jade at the onset is honestly really silly. We eventually find out that Amir himself was a GRE agent just like Crane, and considering that he'd been helping the tower for a while, I have no idea how he is this inept, to hold back a horde of zombies just to fall over and die. I get that he isn't the player character and thus isn't invincible, but come on now. In regards to how the tower's survivors talk to you early on, them calling you 31 seemed like it was going to be significant at some point. You're the 31st infected survivor, I would imagine anyway, so I was expecting to eventually see someone addressing a new guy as 33, then 34, maybe even continuing into the 40s. It's dropped pretty quickly and never gets addressed again. Anyway, one thing that's extremely odd is how, even though a big focal point of Crane's mission is to blend in, hiding his true purpose there, nobody asks him any questions. No one ever gets close to figuring it out. There isn't a moment in the story where his true identity is almost revealed to the people of the tower, only for him to talk his way out of it. Raheem has Crane's radio. Jade likely had some idea that Crane was in the area where a parachute landed without an airdrop, so it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for Raheem, Jade, or Brecken to start questioning him. Instead, Raheem hands over the radio no problem, and continues to sulk about a person who is trapped on the 13th floor. He even says the guy may as well be trapped in a mine cave-in. That line gets more absurd once you figure out it's just one fucking zombie that's trapping him in here. Raheem also says they don't tolerate lazy assholes in the tower, and this general vibe of people assuming Crane is a freeloader is brought up a few times. I genuinely don't understand this sentiment at all. Raheem just said one of the things they do is rescue survivors. Ignoring that, Crane just woke up from a near coma, and there are plenty of people in the tower who don't seem to do anything. Give Crane one of these rifles and let him stand in one place for 12 hours a day. I'm sure he could handle it. Speaking of those guys with guns, why on earth weren't one of them sent to deal with the single zombie on the 13th floor? Brecken is a garbage tier leader, my goodness. The dialogue from the quartermaster when you first talk to him is insane. In this one cutscene, he has 5 times as many lines than the entire rest of the game. I'm of the opinion that this has to be leftover dialogue from a build of the game we didn't get, since he references doing favors for people around the tower to gain their approval, and says you might even find a woman to keep you warm at night. Truly baffling stuff. After he cackles, he turns his attention to the clipboard, never to look up again. If I went at this pace for the whole story, we'd be here another 2 hours, so I'm going to speed it up a bit and only discuss major elements that stuck out to me. The crux of Rise's argument about who Crane is as a person boils down to him being a puppet, a man who follows orders without thinking, but beyond this specific scene where Crane burns the Antizin, there isn't anything else in the story to support that idea. Is it fucking ridiculous that Crane wouldn't try to stash some of the Antizin somewhere in case something goes wrong? Yes, and it's also very convenient for the plot that this just so happened to be the very last Antizin drop forever, as the Ministry of Defense pulled the plug in politics and blah blah blah. Crane's utter ineptitude on this one section aside, what else has he done to paint himself as a sheep? The very next time the GRE asks something of him that he's not a fan of, he says he won't do it.
Fuck you, asshole.
Rise is basing his entire argument on his knowledge that Crane is a GRE operative, and the fact that Crane did a few tasks for Rise without much pushback, which I'll remind everyone that he only did so he could help the people at the tower get life-saving medicine. I can understand Rise hating the GRE, but this philosophical bullshit of trying to expose Crane as a puppet is paper thin. It also says nothing of the player, as these aren't decisions you have any control of. If they were, and there were many more of them, then maybe he might have a point. Maybe he could have even subtly poked at the relationship between player and quest giver, and the idea that a player would do anything for the pat on the head at the end, much like Crane. Instead, Rise is just a fucking madman who thinks he's so much smarter than everyone else. If it exists in this universe, I guarantee Rise is a big fan of Rick and Morty. Rise is completely devoid of depth. He shows no motivation for anything beyond watching the world burn. I mean, really, chaos is the one true order of all things? What a fucking wannabe edgelord embarrassment. Likewise, the haphazard attempt at spinning this into a chaos versus order matchup doesn't land either. Neither character embodies their respective ideology. Crane isn't upholding some sacred code or oath or anything, he's been slaughtering Rise's men without hesitation when he needs to. If the side quests and extra open-world shenanigans are canon, far more often than not, he's been accepting insignificant races, gathering herbs and other random shit for people, and clearing out quarantine zones for his own benefit. Rise, as well, isn't truly promoting chaos. He has a faction that he's the head honcho of. He extorts payments from his clients. He makes examples out of people that go against him. He's a dictator, one that demands more order than Crane does. It's all batshit. I don't understand why they bothered with trying a hand at deeper themes if it was going to end up with what we have now. Likewise, I don't quite understand the motivations of the GRE either. I understand that they want to obtain the file that Rise has on them, as he has threatened to leak the information, which is why the GRE jammed the radios in the city. If the GRE, the global relief effort, was just a front to research the virus in an attempt to weaponize it or sell it, why would they be the ones dropping relief aid to the survivors in the city? Why would they pretend that they were unaware of scientists in Haran working towards a cure? Rise was initially there to protect them so they could work on their research, so the GRE should be very aware that there could still be 2 scientists left in the city that might be conducting valuable research. Likewise, given that the GRE have been feeding Brecken's tower exclusively on where the airdrops will be, I have no idea why they would pretend they don't know which of the 2 factions in Haran Rise is associating with. Even though the GRE stuff was a bit heavy-handed, and constantly having to find a spot to talk to them got old very fast, the fact that the GRE informant is absent for a big chunk of the game is a real shame. Her dynamic with Crane was a lot more captivating than Crane's dynamic with Rise. Rahim as a character is very endearing, playing that little brother role perfectly. His plan to blow up a volatile nest has the same issues as the Alfie quests, where it seems like it would be something that, when completed, would help the city and impact you in some way. Of course it doesn't, and the nest never showed its impact before it blew up either. Considering that Rahim has been thinking about this plan since the first moment you saw him, it does make sense narratively that this is eventually his downfall. However, it does seem rather ridiculous that he goes ahead with the obviously dangerous plan even though everyone around him is telling him not to. The fact that it doesn't change anything for the player is also a big shame. The plan worked, apparently, but all the player gets to experience is a mandatory mediocre story quest and being forced to watch Rahim die in front of their eyes. There's no gameplay outcome at all. The performance from Roger Craig Smith on this particular scene is fucking incredible though. When I realized that Rahim was dead and I was going to have to see a melodramatic reaction from Crane, I was getting ready to cringe, but this felt like a real honest emotional outburst.
That's a fucking bite wound. You goddamn stupid fucking kid!
I'd like to point out that Rise is beyond evil, to the point that he kills his own men on the spot simply because they didn't restrain Crane enough. How the rest of Rise's men don't mutiny is unreal. This pit that you have to fight in for one of the storyline missions is fucking awful. I hated every second of it. The story missions as a whole seem to restrict you more than any other, and given that the story itself isn't great, it wasn't worth the trade-off at all. After the pit, Rise is stupidly antagonistic yet again. Even if his claim that the GRE was going to weaponize the virus, he could easily be lying, mind you, but if that is true, Kyle already said he would look at the file before deciding on what to do with it earlier. Rise uses the fact that Crane was kept in the dark about what the motivations of the GRE were as proof that he's a trained monkey, but it's just a flawed premise. I guarantee if Crane had known the contents of the file, like Rise does, he wouldn't have gone along with their plan. He likely wouldn't have tried to hold it over the GRE's head in an attempt at... well, I don't quite know what Rise's motivations are beyond causing chaos. This clashes with the ending pretty hard, since Rise's goal then becomes to bargain with the GRE so he can get an evac. Fucker had a warlord vacation for a few months, and now he wants to go home. What an utter sociopath. In this rescue scene, Crane is, frankly, a dumbass. Rise is obviously too dangerous to be kept alive. Like, obviously. Crane should have grabbed that gun and shot Rise in the head before tending to the doctor. Crane makes a similar mistake during the ending cutscene, but I'll get to that ending in a moment. After chopping off Rise's hand and escaping, Crane wakes up next to Brecken at the pier. Apparently Brecken had to hide Kyle at the pier as half of Rise's men had been looking for him. Obviously bullshit, as you can easily go to the tower afterwards without any problems. The airdrops apparently stopped 36 hours ago as well, further putting pressure on the player to hurry along with the story and travel to Old Town. It's absolutely bizarre, then, that you can stay in the slums forever. After this cutscene with Brecken, Brecken ceases to exist for the rest of the game. Anytime you visit the tower, you'll never be able to find him. Again, Brecken is a garbage tier leader, good lord. So because the Ministry of Defense has taken over in place of the GRE, they've decided to carpet bomb the entire city. Sound familiar? That's because it happens with almost every zombie-themed piece of media. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it makes sense. However, given that the Ministry of Defense have clearly given a deadline to Crane, 48 hours, none of this makes any sense. This isn't a game with a time limit, but it is one where time passes. Don't put in a dynamic day-night cycle if the game doesn't acknowledge that time passing as canon. That, or simply don't go out of your way to have characters mention specific time deadlines so often. So, in an attempt at showing the world that there are still survivors in the city, and that carpet bombing is not the way to go, their genius big brain plan is, and I'm not fucking kidding, making a frowny face on a building. This is a specific pattern of explosions that zombies wouldn't be capable of, I guess. The cherry on top is that a jet from the Ministry of Defense comes by moments later and erases their work. What a pointless and dumbfounding waste of time. Speaking of a pointless waste of time, everything from Jade being captured all the way to the end of the story is pretty terrible. Jade gets captured, Crane thinks it's not a trap because it's not subtle enough? What the fuck is he talking about? He sneaks in, he kills a bunch of bad guys, and finds Jade randomly in a room. It turns out she was infected, and since Crane is also infected, Rise throws down one antizen shot and makes Crane choose who lives. Crane definitely chooses, but some shenanigans happen, then Jade gives Crane the shot as she's being strangled. Rise claims that Crane yet again had the choice made for him, which, like I just pointed out, isn't true. Crane made the choice himself to give her the shot, which Jade even points out in the hallucination that Crane has. This dream sequence as a whole is fucking bonkers. I think pretty highly of Techland, given that they created this game, and I love so much about it, but this dream sequence is beyond pretentious. I have no idea how anyone could stay invested through all of this boring, snail-paced platform gameplay, especially considering the dialogue from Jade. She really said that at one point she blamed Crane for Amir's death, but then she realized that it was his time? It was time for Amir to go? Her next lines talk about how death is inescapable, that everybody will die at some point and nothing can change that. Like, this is all philosophy 101 at best. It just makes me think the developers were trying way too hard to sound deep, but in the end had absolutely nothing to say. It's also not hard to counter what she's saying. Just because everyone is going to die at some point doesn't mean we should be okay with others dying too soon. Amir's death was pointless, like I've already stated before. He sacrificed himself for no reason, even though he, in all likelihood, had some fucking firecrackers on him, and they also had access to Crane's gun as well. Sacrifice for the sake of giving your death purpose is pointlessly destructive. Jade's sacrifice makes more sense, as Crane is the only one who would have some in with the Ministry of Defense. However, as far as Jade as a character, I legitimately can't wrap my head around caring for her. Not Crane, I can kind of get that, but the player. We just didn't get enough time with her, or really any of the characters besides Rahim. We already don't get to play the game alongside these characters. Every time you're given free reign of Crane is when you're alone. The one exception is fending off zombies with Jade at the end. Many games don't interweave gameplay with narrative, so it isn't inexcusable or anything, but that does put a lot more pressure on the cutscenes and walkie-talkie dialogue to do the heavy lifting. I've played the entire game, the beginning, quite a few times, and have watched the story multiple times on YouTube after the fact. Even still, I simply can't fathom getting attached to Jade. The only thing the two bond over was their relationship with Rahim, but even then, Rahim and Crane didn't get to do much together either, and the only thing Jade and Crane talk about are other characters or the mission. It all just strikes me as a pretty weak attempt at trying to give the story more depth by having the only woman relevant for most of the story die for the player. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that Troy exists, but everything surrounding Jade just seems absurd. She seems much more competent than Brecken, yet she isn't the leader. She trusts Crane far too quickly, not even asking him the most basic of questions before sending him off to collect life-saving medicine. I'd like to point out that this did bite her in the ass, as if someone else went to get the antizin drop, they likely wouldn't have fucking burned it in a garbage can. She makes Rahim Crane's responsibility, even though after the school dynamite mission, she was going back to the tower anyway. Where did she even go? If your answer to that question is getting the tissue samples from the doctor, the Rahim Mayday happened moments after Crane left his trailer, so she definitely should have been on top of what was going on. The fact that she was totally fine with posters of herself staying hung up on the walls in the tower strikes me as very odd as well. I think an easy character building moment would have been to show her tearing down one of those posters, getting passionate about how none of that matters anymore. It could even fit in with her final speech in the dream sequence if the writers wanted it to, about having a purpose and all of that. All of this is to say, Jade as a character and her actions when it comes to plot progression were a pretty big failure. The only thing she managed to do was die for the main protagonist and raise a bunch of baby's first philosophical points about life and death. Congratulations. Anyway, Tahir as a boss fight is fine, I guess, but if anything, it just proves my point from earlier. The only way this is difficult or climactic in any way is because your equipment has been stripped from you again. Crane killing Tahir, under the mentality that Tahir isn't a loose end you leave untied, is pretty rich. Maybe he should have extended that sentiment towards Rise, then Jade wouldn't be dead. Kyle getting his message out about there still being people in Haran right as the planes were on the way to carpet bomb the city is utterly fucking ridiculous. Why do they keep pulling this, where things are done in the nick of time even though time doesn't matter? It's immersion shattering beyond belief. The final confrontation with Rise is in a way good and in another way stupid. On one hand, I am happy they elected not to have a traditional boss encounter with Rise, as I have no idea how they could have made that work. On the other hand, the QuickTime event fight isn't really that interesting, and the cutscene and dialogue afterwards is pretty underwhelming. When Rise is on the ropes, he tells Crane to finish the job. Of course, Crane is a white meat babyface with no object permanence or capacity for forward thinking, and decides not to. I will admit, one particular voice line was incredible.
Prove you are a man. Take your vengeance.
Will you just shut the fuck up?
But of course afterwards, who would have guessed it? Crane letting Rise live turned out to be a bad decision. Whoa! In the end, Crane kills Rise anyway, so really this only managed to prolong the inevitable and introduce a lot more risk to the situation. Crane turning down the helicopter is noble, opting to stay in the city with the precious virus data as it will prevent the GRE from bombing the place. The game then ends with Dr. Camden saying he is certain a cure is within reach. Considering that Dying Light 2 exists, I think he's a big fat phony. Regardless of how you feel about the overall story, there's really no getting around it. It didn't end in a conclusive or definitive way. Perhaps this could be viewed as the game contextually allowing players to play around in Haran forever. Either way, if you're the type of person who likes to play a game through once and move on, Dying Light doesn't end on a high note. Thankfully, there's the DLC The Following, which picks up seemingly not too far in the future from where we left off. The tower is running out of antizin, which, I mean, okay, I guess, they already were, but now it's super serious. That being the case, when a man comes in rambling about a nearby countryside that supposedly has a group of infected survivors that are immune, Lena tells Crane he has to go there to check it out. We never see or hear from Brecken in all of this, further cementing his status as a garbage leader. In his defense, Raheem and Jade both died recently, so maybe he's transitioned his leadership role to somebody else. The opening cliffside platforming of The Following is mystifying. Is Techland not aware that players will have and abuse the grappling hook at this point? I had to go out of my way to cross a gap by walking over a downed tree like you're supposed to. I figured by now they could assume the player had the grappling hook, but if the problem was that they couldn't be sure the player had it when starting a new save file on the DLC, I'd say give it to them as they spawn in and start strong, showing that it will be necessary for some things from here on out. It unfortunately isn't necessary for anything, unless you left your vehicle somewhere and are traveling on foot. The main gimmick of this DLC is the driving, and even though the controls feel good and the first-person perspective in the buggy is immersive as hell, its inclusion goes against some of the strongest qualities of Dying Light. The platforming and parkour movement system is at the heart of the game, yet in The Following, you'll more often than not be driving around in your buggy. You are able to engage with the tried-and-true mechanics like before in small villages and one decently sized town, but it obviously isn't the same. In the base game, getting around the map quickly would mean utilizing your free-running skills as you avoid zombies and find treasure or supplies on the way. In The Following, it means driving around, sometimes running into zombies, fences, or scarecrows, all while pulling the map up constantly to make sure you're headed in the right direction. Once you do spot a place to gather supplies and look for treasure, you'll hop out and play the game normally. It turns the once spontaneous nature of the exploration into an endless loop of pit stops. Oh, you found somewhere that looks out of the ordinary. Better hop out of your vehicle and search through it for 5 minutes, then it's back to the open road. Remember when I said that if this were any other game, I'd likely say that the map was too big for its own good? I was able to let that slide since it seemed like stretching out Haran was done to benefit the free running. In Dying Light, you're faster on foot than in a lot of open world games, and the city is extremely dense, so throwing a few reused assets in here and there isn't the end of the world. Well, there's frankly no excuse now, and if anything, The Following is even worse with the copy-paste issue. Because there are barely any houses as it is, seeing two of them right next to each other with the same exact layout, furniture, and groupings of the same pictures 5 times in each house is incredibly jarring. The countryside as a whole was likely designed the same way as Haran was, in the sense that they worked backwards from your mode of transportation. Now that you have a car and are expected to use it all the time, they womboed the map to an absurd level. This was likely done to benefit the game and its driving mechanics, as if the map had been a quarter of the size, you wouldn't have as many unique stretches of land to drive through. If that is the case, and it's a premise we can all get behind, I think the addition of driving was a mistake. The time spent in the buggy, while aren't terrible, certainly didn't make up for the fact that I'd be spending an inordinate amount of time traveling to the next destination. They really made sure players had to use the buggy, as traveling on foot is somehow slower than you think it would be. Even though the map is so gigantic that you can't come close to having it all on screen, the distance between landmarks is even bigger than it appears. What looks like it would take 30 seconds at most ended up taking a few minutes. A few minutes of not doing much. The amount of time spent in the countryside traveling back and forth, either to your buggy or in your buggy to a destination, is enormous. There are a few makeshift challenges that pop up from time to time, but beyond them granting some experience for your driving skill tree, I wasn't that interested in them. The skill tree itself is, in a way, pretty cool. If you're a fully leveled up character, you'll get to enjoy the progression of leveling a skill tree again. Upgrading the car itself isn't as involved as I'd like it to be, however. You just pick stuff from a menu. The most visceral aspect of managing your car is finding gas to fill up your tank. Scavenging from gas stations or broken down cars yourself before fueling up the tank in real time feels a lot more involved than simply pressing the Y button to repair everything or equipping the newest unlockable. While a few of the upgrades are nice, they take too long to unlock. I finished every side quest in The Following, and even then, I barely got to level 13. I spent a disproportionate amount of my time driving in the countryside without the cool flamethrower or electric cage. When you take into consideration how much content is in the following expansion, that seems kind of insane. Not having the electric cage or flamethrower for most of it is also insane for a different reason, that being that the zombies in the following are even more difficult. There's a slightly bigger variation of the biters, which has a bigger health pool, some mutated bigger boys here and there as well, but for me, what got on my nerves more than anything else were the virals. Not only do these barren stretches of land provide no break in the line of sight when a viral spots you, they spawn out of thin air constantly. Because your car can't do much to them without upgrades, besides driving right into a fucking tree to get them off of you, you very well may end up getting out of your car to smack them in the face a few times. This got old very fast, but even ignoring the driving situation, the virals were way more plentiful in the countryside than in Haran for some reason. Where you might have had 2 or 3 surround you in the base game, you'll have 5 or 6 at a time in the DLC. I can only speak for myself on this issue, but fending off a half dozen virals every 5 minutes is extremely tedious, and it's made all the more ridiculous when you see them spawn on the map out of nowhere. Like I said before, the amount of content on offer is pretty impressive, but I can't pretend the quality of that content is anything spectacular. The only side quest I was able to remember without looking back at my recordings is the one with the fucking kids. They lure you in over the radio, calling for help. Once you get there, you then realize it was a trap. They just wanted the big demolisher to kill you so they could take your stuff. These kids are the fucking devil, and I've tried more than a few times to kill them. This quest is also a perfect example to show just how scripted the events and locations can be in this game, especially this DLC. You end up getting a plethora of missing persons objectives where you'll find a dead person, roll them over, grab their ID, and alert the leader of the survivors nearby that one of their people was found dead. It's not that fun, it's mostly used as an excuse for the player to travel all over the map. You collect these tasks from the boards in each of the 2 main hubs. Every time I saw something new, I grabbed it immediately, and I'd imagine most players did the same. This, unfortunately, may cause players to waste their time trying to find the missing person in the warehouse. You only get the radio message from the kids after completing a certain story mission, so if you come to the warehouse and search for the body before that, you'll be extremely confused. The area where the body is blocked, as that's where the demolisher will break through in a scripted sequence later on. The hole in the grating above you can't be accessed with your grappling hook either, as there's an invisible barrier there for some reason. The shelves are also unclimbable, even though Crane is the parkour master of the world. I spent a good 10 minutes trying anything I could to climb up there, or get around it somehow, before eventually finding the answer online. This, to me, is simply inexcusable. I have no idea how Techland didn't catch this and fix it. Either only give out that missing persons objective after the kids' radio quest is received, lock the warehouse up completely so the player wouldn't even see the opening in the grating before they're supposed to, or give the questline to the player earlier, before they would even have a chance to waste their time in the warehouse. Surprisingly, this quest had even more bugs associated with it. If you try to find a way up to the kids to slice their heads off like they deserve, you might end up exploring this room that you didn't have access to before. There's a door over here, which is locked, but it tells you nothing, as so many of these doors are locked for no reason anyway. This one, however, does require a key that can be found on the Demolisher's corpse. The same corpse that can potentially disappear. That's right, I couldn't finish this questline as the game despawned the corpse I needed that had the key, which meant I had to reload a previous save. How incredible is that, right? Another scripted moment that broke my immersion more than any other was with the Drought questline. You go to restore the power at the pumping station, only to find bandits in there that you'll have to kill. Then this happens.
Oh my god. What's going on? Don't hurt me. I give up. I give up.
It's not that surprising that you can't harm an NPC, right? Right? Well, watch what happens at the end of the interrogation.
Not like that.
Yeah, he ends up dying anyway, and he didn't even give up any information that wasn't already plainly obvious. I don't mean to sound condescending, but really, what was Techland thinking here? You were forced to murder these bandits without any other option. In Dying Light, you can't take hostages or prisoners, you can't give any human enemy mercy that doesn't involve running away from your objective. Finding the balance between life and death when it comes to your enemies isn't something that the game ever asks of the player. That being said, when they see another bandit break a door down, the same door that a bandit had broken down in an earlier mission that you did have to kill, what did they think was going to happen? Of course players would shoot this guy. That's always what the game encourages at every turn. If Techland doesn't understand the strengths and weaknesses of their own game enough to catch something like this before it makes its way into the final product, consider me worried about what we'll see in Dying Light 2. It's all the worse considering this break in suspension of disbelief was pointless. The bandit had nothing of value to say and wasn't integral to any other facet of the game, or even this quest line. Thankfully they aren't all bad, as those were the worst of the worst. I would imagine my favorite 2 quest lines were ones that didn't resonate with other players. There's a kid who has been waiting on a present from Mr. Postmister, so you head to the post office in the town nearby. This post office is one of the best places in the DLC as far as I'm concerned. The majority of the collectible notes in the DLC being here, in the post office, was a great surprise. It might look like that's a weird decision, to clump so many collectibles in one area, but for believability, it makes perfect sense. You not only get to find the kids package in a mail van nearby, but you also find 3 letters addressed to people you've seen around in the village. Being able to return them to the proper recipients honestly brought me a lot of joy. If you couldn't tell by now, I'm a big fan of Death Stranding, so this delivery fetch quest stuff is right up my alley. Because the characters that received their letters responded accordingly, it had a satisfying enough conclusion that I still look back and wish there were more letters to find in the DLC. I've defended fetch quests enough for one video, but really, this is what I mean when I say that the context and setting make all the difference.
Here, brought you something from the post office.
Are you kidding? That's great. Wow. For fuck's sake, you brought me my power bill.
My other favorite quest is actually 2 quests in one. I didn't even realize the genius of this mission until after the fact. The player gets 2 different prompts that bring them to 2 different entry points to a cave. One where you're supposed to investigate strange noises near the well, and one where you're supposed to find the food-stealing creature near the cave. Both of those are the same quest, you just begin in different locations. I started from the park where the well was, and found the kid turned zombie right away. I had no context to any of this, and walking through his makeshift home was genuinely really sad. As you keep exploring the cave, you'll swim underwater to the other side, where the kid's dad was. Right before he dies, he tells you to not let his child die of hunger. After you exit the cave, 2 hunters are outside of it, saying they were after a creature who had been stealing food, and they shot and wounded it before it went to go hide in this cave. Only then I realized that the dad died because these hunters thought he was the creature stealing food. He was stealing food, but for his son, which you can even see near the well section of the cave. The reason this quest resonated with me was because I was able to go through it backwards. If I was only able to go the other way, everything would have made sense in a linear fashion. Hunters shoot a creature, it's a man, he has a kid, his kid is a zombie, you kill the zombie. That's all right, but the mystery of seeing it in reverse order felt a lot more real. Like this is something that could end up happening in a real adventure, where you won't always find the next set of objectives laid out for you in a logical fashion. It's like you stumbled onto something organic, something that you had no control of, you were just a witness to the events without any context. Before moving on, how could I not include Tolga and Fatine again? They managed to get an airplane working, but they crash-landed in the countryside and had to parachute out. There's nothing that crazy or new about them in this DLC, but it was pretty incredible to hear their voices out of nowhere again. They construct another crazy contraption, this time a rocket-strapped train car. Initially, it seems like they die, but right before the end of the DLC story, you hear them on the radio again, proclaiming that they made it to the other side successfully. Out of all of the characters in Dying Light, Tolga and Fatine are the ones I expect to see in Dying Light 2 more than any other. There's obviously many more quests I could talk about, but I don't think I have enough to say on them, so I'll move on. Esgi is a thing? Yes, okay, let's move on. There aren't any quarantine zones in the countryside, but there are volatile nests, which are just as great, if not better. Finding the entrance to the cave in the first place is enjoyable in a way that's hard to explain. It's like a puzzle of exploration, poking and prodding at the environment until you finally find the one weakness. Breaking in under the guise of stealth, either with camouflage or crafty kills, is just as fun as going in guns blazing as an action hero. Even though I know these don't impact the world in any way, like cutting down on the spread of volatiles or something, because the nests go away from your map, it feels much more permanent than the quarantine zones, where you can do those over and over. When you first arrive in the countryside, it's drilled into your head that you'll need to help the people with their problems if you want to proceed with the story. This is what I mentioned earlier, where the original idea for the main game of winning over the locals by doing favors for them was instead implemented in this DLC. The implementation of the mechanic is pretty lackluster, however, as really all it does is give you another level up bar to fill, which unlocks rewards as you go. This is my obligatory mention of the crossbow reward, which I'm sure a lot of people would comment about if I didn't mention it. It's a reward, it's kinda cool. Okay, that's all I have to say about it. Since I'm in the mood for mentioning things before wrapping this video up, you can also acquire a military keycard, which can open some military crates that are all around the map. Again, that's kinda cool. And again, that's all I have to say about it. I don't have much to say about the story either, unfortunately. Well, it's fortunate for me, as that means less time writing and editing this already very long video. From what I can gather by only half paying attention, there was a cult in this area that went out of style long ago, but when the zombies became a thing, the cult became popular again. They have a way to subdue the zombies, meaning they can effectively avoid being attacked or bitten by any zombie that gets close. The reason Crane is here is to find a cure or a medicine to bring back to Haran, as the tower's people are all infected and are on the verge of turning. If not for the ending to this DLC, this plot point would be very silly. It seems like every hour on the hour it's mentioned how desperate the tower back at Haran is, and how in need they are of medicine. Crane is urged to hurry up every time he's able to contact Lena on the radio. It got me to roll my eyes every time, as I was so conditioned to how things played out in the main game. Anyway, Crane eventually meets the cult, does favors for them, finds out that Rise's men had come here, figures out eventually that the guy from way back at the beginning of the DLC, who you'd been nice to, was in charge of Rise's guys and the bandits the whole time. The final mission has you doing a quasi-escape sequence, racing the bandits to the dam in your car. The mother is the leader of the cult, and is who you keep hearing in your head at other points in the DLC. She explains how the mist that keeps the zombies at bay came from vials originally, and when she and her children discovered the vials after escaping zombies, she tested them out herself to see if they were medicine or not. It turned her into a mix of a zombie and a human. In the dark, she's a feral and ferocious zombie, but in the light, she retains her humanity. It's a pretty cool visual. You then get told that breathing in the mist on its own will turn people into what she has become as well, it just takes longer. I'm not sure how much truth there was to that statement, as she forces Kyle to drink the vial anyway, which is why he eventually turns into what she is. The end fight against her is probably the best traditional boss fight in the entire game, so kudos to Techland for finishing strong. You initially have your guns with you, but after a while, you slowly start to transition into a zombie, only being able to use your claw-gripped hands to swipe at the mother. Her getting tougher and tougher the lower health she has makes the fight feel really tense close to the end, a nice climactic way to finish it out. After you defeat her, Kyle stumbles and hallucinates while he tries to escape with the vials. He ends up in a non-infected area of the world, probably the city nearest Haran. The kids in the park scream when they see him, as Kyle has now become a volatile. Even though the ending to the main game left me rolling my eyes, the following's ending left me with a sense of melancholy. All of those calls from Lena urging you to hurry up so you can save the day, the deadlines that seemingly are just there to raise the stakes for the inevitable third act conclusion, don't matter anymore. Crane didn't make it back. We don't know what happened to the people in Haran. Crane came here to find medicine and bring it back to the people of the city, something that seemed like it was going to happen in some way or another. Maybe he would come back empty-handed, but he would still make it back. We'd still see the tower again. Except we didn't. The game is over. There's nothing left. Ending Kyle's story in such a conclusive fashion was such a pleasant surprise. It would be interesting if we saw the volatile version of him in the sequel, but even if we don't, Kyle had a great run. It's funny that for how much was said about sacrifice earlier on with Jade and Amir, Kyle kind of sacrificed himself as well. Even though it didn't accomplish anything in the end, this wasn't a pointless self-destruction like Amir's sacrifice was. Sometimes sacrifices are in vain, even though they were made with the best intentions. While Amir was too stupid to use firecrackers or use a gun to hold off a few zombies, Kyle went as far as he possibly could have in the wild goose chase that was finding medicine to help his friends. This was their last-ditch effort. He had to see it through. In doing so, the tower lost its most competent ally, and in all likelihood, all of the survivors are now dead, or have become zombies themselves. I know it may not seem like it at times during this video, but I really enjoyed my time with Dying Light. There's always this thought in the back of my mind that maybe I just haven't experienced enough, maybe I haven't played enough to know what stands out and what doesn't. To me, the moments where I was immersed in the game early on, I don't think are comparable to anything else I've played in the makeshift zombie genre. There was really something addicting about exploring Haran, chasing down airdrops, and completing quarantine zones. I was genuinely hooked. It kept me up at night. All I wanted to do was get out of bed and get right back to the slums to finish some quests. So many elements converge to make this game as appealing as it is, including the fun weapons you can create, the realistic and captivating atmosphere, the soundtrack, the visuals, the voice acting, and of course, the fantastic parkour-inspired movement system. There are many ways in which Dying Light could be improved, but in a way that only made the game stand out even more. It was so close to being phenomenal that all I could think at times was how great the game is now, to be inches from perfection. I can only hope Techland learns from Dying Light and makes their next game all the better. If they take what they have now and improve on it, expand on it, it could very easily be one of the best games I've ever played. By now, Dying Light 2 is definitely out, surely, so I can only hope they've taken some inspiration from the likes of Breath of the Wild, Death Stranding, and of course the base game of Dying Light. It's all there. They have a chance to make a perfect game. The cynical part of me, however, can't shake the feeling that they're going to double down on the wrong things. If the following expansion is anything to go by, then I'd imagine there's going to be a ton of fluff, a mediocre story, uninteresting characters, and that feeling of missed potential yet again. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you were able to get through this monster of a video. I absolutely did not expect this to be as long as it turned out to be, but I just felt like discussing every aspect of the game this time. Let me know if you think this is too long or too short. Shout out, for real this time, to the Patreon supporters who helped make this video possible. This was the game they chose instead of Astral Chain and Lord of the Rings Conquest. If you'd like a say and a vote sometime in the future, you can subscribe to the Patreon. Follow me on Twitter and subscribe to this channel as well. I recently hit 5,000 subs as well, which is great, but I want more. The next videos on the channel, honestly, could be anything. I can never predict what I'll do, but I'll list out all the possibilities. Dying Light 2, Elden Ring, Returnal, Babylon's Fall, Astral Chain, Project Zomboid, the Lost Planet series, Earth Defense Force series, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 8, Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2, or loads of other indie games. Honestly, who knows at this point? Either way, whatever comes out next, I hope to see you there. Have a good one.